Some tragedies don't announce themselves with sirens or headlines. They don't come wrapped in black ribbon or accompanied by condolence cards. They happen on ordinary Tuesday afternoons while you're making coffee, or during the commercial break of a show you're not really watching. They slip into your life wearing the costume of normalcy, so quietly that you don't recognise them as endings until years later, when you're standing in your childhood kitchen, now painted a different colour, wondering when everything changed. The last time your parents picked you up happened without fanfare. There was no ceremonial final lift, no moment where anyone said, "This is it, you're too big now." It was probably a mundane evening after soccer practice or school, your mother's arms reaching for you one last time, your father hoisting you onto his shoulders for what would be the final ride. You were likely thinking about homework or what was for dinner, completely unaware that childhood was ending one small gesture at a time. But that's how most of our significant moments work. They masquerade as insignificant ones. The last time you believed in magic wasn't marked by a ceremony of disillusionment. It faded like sunset so gradually that you never noticed the exact moment when wonder became skepticism. One day, you simply realised you hadn't looked for monsters under the bed in months, hadn't wished on a dandelion in so long that you'd forgotten the specific texture of that particular hope. These unmarked transitions create a peculiar kind of grief. We mourn the photo we never took, not the staged family portraits or milestone celebrations, but the candid moment that would have captured something essential. Your grandmother's hands as she sorted through her button collection, each small disc a remnant of dresses long worn out and discarded. The way morning light fell across your first apartment's kitchen table, illuminating the specific quality of solitude that felt like freedom rather than loneliness. These uncaptured images become more precious for their absence, developing in the dark room of memory into something more beautiful than any camera could have recorded. The weight of the unrecorded accumulates differently than documented loss. We have rituals for marked endings, graduation ceremonies, retirement parties, funerals, but there's no protocol for mourning the phase of life that ended while you were busy living it. The years when you knew all your neighbours' names, when walking to school felt like an adventure rather than a chore, when your biggest worry was whether you'd pick the right lunchbox for the day. These periods don't end, they simply become something else, like water changing states so gradually that you only notice when it's already vapour. A friend drifts away not through argument or betrayal, but through the simple physics of diverging paths. First, the phone calls become text messages. Then the text messages become holiday wishes. Then the holiday wishes become likes on social media posts about lives you no longer recognise. You remember when you knew the sound of their laugh, the exact way they took their coffee, the story behind that scar on their thumb. Now they're a name in your contacts list attached to memories that feel almost fictional in their distance. This kind of loss defies the traditional stages of grief because there's nothing definitive to mourn. No one died, no one moved away, no one betrayed anyone. Time simply did what time does. It moved forward, and in moving it changed the shape of everything it touched. The friendship didn't end. It transformed into something else entirely, something that resembles friendship the way a photograph resembles the actual moment it captured. Dreams dissolve with the same quiet persistence. The novel you were going to write doesn't disappear in a moment of artistic crisis. It fades through 1,000 small compromises. The evening you chose television over writing, the weekend you chose sleep over creativity, the month you chose safety over risk. Each individual choice seems reasonable, even necessary. But collectively they build into something irreversible. One day you realise you haven't opened the document in 6 months, and the story that once felt urgent now seems like something a stranger might have imagined. The erosion of ambition isn't dramatic, it's practical. It wears comfortable clothes and speaks the language of responsibility. It suggests that dreams are luxury items you can't afford right now, that you can always return to them later when life is less complicated. But life never becomes less complicated. It only becomes different kinds of complicated. The dream doesn't die, it just gets pushed so far down the priority list that eventually it falls off the bottom, joining the collection of former selves you accumulated and abandoned without ceremony. Inside jokes lose their meaning through a similar process of gradual abandonment. The phrase that once sent you and your college roommate into hysterical laughter now requires explanation, context, a small history lesson about who you used to be and why that person found certain things hilarious. The joke isn't funny anymore, not because it was never funny, but because the people who understood it no longer exist. You've both evolved beyond the shared reference point that gave the humour its power. Language changes as we change, but we don't always notice our vocabulary shifting until we reach for a word that's no longer there. The pet names you had for each other, the private shorthand you developed for concepts that only made sense within the specific ecosystem of your relationship. These disappear when the relationship evolves, leaving behind a peculiar kind of linguistic grief. You mourn not just the joke, but the version of yourself who understood it instinctively. Your childhood bedroom stops being yours in increments so small they're almost imperceptible. First, it becomes a guest room that happens to contain your old furniture. Then it becomes a guest room with some storage. Eventually it becomes an office or craft room with a twin bed pushed against one wall, your trophies and posters replaced by practical shelving and neutral paint colours. The transformation makes perfect sense. Your parents need the space, you haven't lived there in years. There's no reason to maintain a shrine to your adolescence. But logic doesn't soften the strange sadness of standing in that space years later, searching for evidence of the person you used to be and finding only efficient storage solutions. The room remembers nothing of your teenage angst, your late-night phone conversations, your dreams of escape and plans for the future. It has moved on without sentiment, which feels like a small betrayal, even though you understand the necessity. Our voices change and we don't notice until someone plays us a recording from years ago. The shift happens so gradually that we never experience the transition. One day we simply sound different, our tone deeper or lighter, our accent softened or sharpened by geography and experience. The voice captured in old voicemails becomes a stranger's voice, evidence of a person we remember being but can no longer access. We sound like someone we used to know very well but haven't spoken to in years. This vocal evolution parallels a deeper transformation that happens without our awareness. We become different people through such incremental changes that we never notice the moment of becoming. The person who left that voicemail had different worries, different dreams, different ways of seeing the world. They weren't wrong or naive. They were simply operating from a different set of experiences, like someone living in a different decade altogether. Our hands begin to look like our parents' hands through a process so slow it defies observation. One day you glance down while typing or washing dishes and see familiar gestures performed by unfamiliar fingers. The shape is the same, but the texture has changed. Lines appearing where smooth skin used to be, veins becoming more prominent, the subtle thickening that comes with decades of use. You recognize the genetic echo, the way certain expressions pass down through generations like inherited melodies. This physical inheritance feels both inevitable and surprising. You spent years trying to differentiate yourself from your parents, developing your own style, your own way of moving through the world. But genetics has its own timeline, its own agenda. Eventually, you find yourself unconsciously mimicking gestures you swore you'd never make, hearing your mother's words come out of your mouth with your father's intonation. The mirror becomes a time machine, reflecting not just who you are, but who you're becoming. Each morning you negotiate with this gradually shifting image, adjusting to changes so subtle they're almost subliminal. The face looking back isn't entirely yours anymore, but it isn't entirely foreign either. It exists in the liminal space between familiarity and strangeness, like a photograph that's been slightly overexposed, recognizable but somehow different. A version of yourself that never got to say goodbye haunts the edges of memory. The person you were before that relationship ended, before that job changed you, before that loss rewrote your understanding of the world. These former selves don't die dramatically, they simply stop being relevant. Like clothes that no longer fit or books you've outgrown. But unlike clothes or books, you can't donate these discarded selves to charity. They remain part of your personal archaeology, buried but not gone. You carry these abandoned versions of yourself like sedimentary layers, each one representing a different era of your becoming. The optimist who believed everything would work out eventually. The cynic who trusted nothing and no one, the romantic who saw magic in ordinary moments. These people were real. They made decisions, formed relationships, left impacts on the world. But they've been so thoroughly integrated into who you are now that accessing them feels like trying to remember a dream after waking. Sometimes you catch glimpses of these former selves in old photographs or journal entries, evidence of people you're sure you must have been but can barely recognize. They seem simultaneously familiar and foreign, like distant relatives you met once at a family reunion. You remember being them, but you can't remember what it felt like to be them, what the world looked like through their eyes, what seemed important enough to care about. The tragedy isn't that these versions of yourself have disappeared. Transformation is natural, necessary, often beneficial. The tragedy is that they departed without ceremony, without acknowledgement, without the chance to say goodbye to the people they loved or the dreams they carried. They simply faded into the person you've become, their individual voices absorbed into the chorus of your current self. This process of continual becoming means we're always in mourning for someone we used to be. We grieve not just our own transformations, but the way time changes everything we touch. The relationships that have evolved beyond recognition, the places that have been developed beyond our memories, the cultural moments that have been replaced by new trends we don't understand. Time moves through us like water through soil, changing the landscape so gradually that we only notice when we try to return to something that's no longer there. We search for the favourite restaurant that closed, the park that was turned into a parking lot, the friend who's become a stranger. We discover that home isn't a place you can return to. It's a constellation of moments that exist only in memory, preserved in the amber of nostalgia but impossible to revisit. The quiet tragedy of temporal displacement affects everyone, but it feels uniquely personal each time it happens. We each discover that we're temporary residents in our own lives, that everything we think of as permanent is actually just persistent, lasting long enough to feel stable but not long enough to be eternal. We learn to love things while knowing they'll change, to invest in relationships while accepting their impermanence, to build meaning on foundations we know are shifting beneath us. This isn't pessimism, it's the basic physics of being human. We exist in time, which means we exist in constant transformation. The tragedy isn't that things change. The tragedy is that we're often unprepared for the depth of our attachment to things as they were. We mourn not just what we've lost, but our own capacity to lose things we didn't realize we were holding so tightly. Time moves on without asking permission, without checking whether we're ready, without offering explanations for its relentless progression. It carries us forward whether we want to go or not, transforming us through the simple act of duration. We become different people not through dramatic events, but through the accumulated weight of ordinary moments, each one adding its small contribution to the person we're slowly becoming. And perhaps the deepest quiet tragedy of all is this. We become so good at adapting to loss that we forget to notice it happening. We develop such sophisticated mechanisms for processing change that we sometimes miss the opportunity to honour what's ending. We become experts at moving on without always taking the time to acknowledge what we're moving on from. But recognising these quiet losses doesn't mean wallowing in them. It means developing a more nuanced relationship with impermanence, learning to hold things lightly without holding them carelessly. It means understanding that grief for small losses is as valid as grief for large ones, that the accumulated weight of tiny endings can be as heavy as any single dramatic conclusion. We learn to carry our quiet tragedies like a second heartbeat, present but not overwhelming, a reminder that we're alive enough to lose things, human enough to mourn them, and resilient enough to continue becoming whoever we're meant to be next. The geography of almost love is mapped in silence. It exists in the space between what was felt and what was spoken, between the reaching and the touching, between the hoping and the knowing. These territories of undelivered affection create their own weather systems, sudden storms of possibility followed by long droughts of reality. We navigate them without guidebooks, learning their customs through trial and error, through the accumulation of moments that mattered more to us than to anyone else. The "I love you" you never said carries a weight that delivered words rarely match. It lives in your throat like a stone you've learned to swallow daily. becoming heavier with each passing moment of silence. You rehearse it in mirrors, practice it in empty rooms, feel it pressing against your teeth during ordinary conversations about weather and weekend plans, but the right moment never comes, or it comes and goes so quickly that by the time you recognize it, it's already become a memory of missed opportunity. This unspoken declaration develops its own life cycle. At first, it feels urgent, desperate for release, like a secret that burns to be shared. You imagine the relief of finally saying it, the way confession might lighten the load of carrying such overwhelming certainty. But as weeks turn to months, the urgency transforms into something more complex, a private treasure you're simultaneously desperate to share and terrified to lose. The unsaid "I love you" becomes precious precisely because it remains uncontaminated by response or rejection. The text message you retyped and deleted represents a particular kind of modern heartbreak. Each draft carries its own emotional archaeology, the first version too eager, the second too casual, the third trying to strike an impossible balance between honesty and self-protection. You craft and discard dozens of variations, each one revealing a different strategy for emotional survival. The message that finally gets sent bears little resemblance to what you actually wanted to say, filtered through so many layers of second-guessing that the original sentiment becomes unrecognizable. But it's the deleted messages that tell the real story. They contain the raw truth of your feelings, unedited by fear or social convention. "I miss you" becomes "hope you're well." "I dream about you every night" becomes "been thinking of you." "Please come back" becomes nothing at all. The drafts folder of your phone holds a secret collection of honesty too dangerous to send, a private museum of feelings you couldn't risk making real. Technology has created new categories of romantic tragedy. The read receipt that confirms your vulnerability was witnessed but not reciprocated. The typing indicator that appears and disappears without resolution, suggesting responses that are composed and abandoned, leaving you to imagine what they might have said if courage had prevailed. These digital breadcrumbs create their own emotional ecosystem, where the absence of response becomes a response, where silence speaks its own complicated language. Someone who looked back and you didn't wave occupies a special category of regret. This moment usually unfolds in slow motion in memory, the recognition dawning too late, the opportunity crystallizing just as it dissolves. They turned around because something made them hope you might be watching, might share their curiosity about connection. But you were distracted, looking elsewhere, missing the small miracle of mutual interest by seconds or inches. These missed connections accumulate into a parallel life of what-if scenarios. The train platform where you almost met someone's eyes but looked away at the crucial moment. The coffee shop where someone smiled at you and you smiled back but neither of you had the courage to cross the room. The conference or party or random Tuesday afternoon where paths almost crossed, where stories almost began, where loneliness almost ended but didn't. The tragedy isn't just the missed opportunity but the way these moments haunt the spaces they didn't occupy. You return to the same coffee shop hoping to recreate conditions that can't be recreated. You take the same train at the same time, scanning faces for someone who probably doesn't even remember looking back. You become a detective investigating a crime that never happened, gathering evidence for a case that was never opened. The person who fell for you a second too late embodies one of love's cruelest mathematical problems. Timing in relationships operates according to laws that seem designed to maximize emotional inefficiency. When you're ready, they're not. When they're available, you're committed elsewhere. When you're both single, one of you lives in a different city, works different hours, exists in a different emotional season altogether. This temporal misalignment creates its own mythology. You meet someone perfect for you at precisely the wrong moment, the week before you move across the country, the day after you start dating someone else, the month when you finally decided to focus on yourself instead of relationships. The universe seems to specialize in these cosmic jokes, offering exactly what you want when accepting it would require dismantling the life you've already built. The almost relationships that result from bad timing carry a particular poignancy. They exist in a state of suspended animation, too real to dismiss, but too incomplete to mourn properly. You exchange meaningful glances and profound conversations while navigating around the obstacles that prevent anything from developing. The chemistry is undeniable, the connection authentic, but the circumstances insurmountable. A hug that meant more to you than to them reveals the hidden asymmetries of human affection. Physical contact that feels electric to one person can register as merely pleasant to another. You find yourself analysing the duration, the pressure, the way they pulled away or lingered. Was that pause significant, or are you reading poetry into prose? Did their heartbeat quicken, or was that just yours echoing against their chest? These moments of mismatched intensity occur constantly, but rarely get acknowledged. The handshake that lasted a beat too long, the accidental brush of fingers reaching for the same door handle, the way they touched your shoulder while laughing at your joke, their hand lingering just long enough to create hope, but not long enough to create certainty. You become a scholar of micro gestures, passing meaning from movements that might be unconscious. Physical affection operates in multiple languages simultaneously. Touch that speaks volumes to one person might be conversational to another. You learn to translate these differences, to calibrate your interpretations, to protect yourself from reading too much into gestures that might mean nothing beyond politeness or friendship. But occasionally, you encounter someone who makes you feel visible in your skin, whose casual touch seems to recognize something essential about who you are. The way someone once made you feel visible and then didn't represents a particular form of emotional whiplash. Visibility, true recognition of your inner self, is rare enough that when it happens, it feels like coming home to a place you'd never been before. Someone sees through your carefully constructed presentations to the person underneath, and responds with delight, interest, genuine appreciation. For a moment, you experience yourself as they see you, and the view is revelation. But visibility can't be sustained indefinitely. People get distracted, relationships evolve, attention shifts to other priorities. The person who once saw you clearly becomes busy, preoccupied, focused elsewhere. They don't stop caring, they just stop looking with the same intensity. You find yourself performing more and more elaborate versions of the person they once noticed, trying to recapture their gaze, to remind them of what they found interesting about you. The loss of visibility is harder to process than the loss of affection, because it challenges your understanding of your own worth. If someone could see something wonderful in you and then lose interest, what does that say about the sustainability of your appeal? You begin to question whether you imagined their original enthusiasm, whether you misinterpreted casual interest as profound recognition. A long stare across a room that never became a beginning contains entire novels of possibility compressed into a single moment. Eyes meet across crowded spaces with an intensity that seems to slow time, creating pockets of intimacy in public places. These visual conversations can feel more intimate than actual touch, more revealing than verbal exchanges. For the duration of the stare, you exist in a bubble of shared attention that excludes everything else. But eye contact can't sustain itself indefinitely. Someone always looks away first, breaking the spell, returning both parties to the ordinary world of separate lives and competing priorities. The moment dissolves without ceremony, leaving behind only the memory of potential energy that never found release. You spend the rest of the evening, or sometimes years, wondering what would have happened if one of you had been brave enough to walk across the room. These wordless exchanges create their own emotional ecosystem. The sustained glance that suggests mutual recognition, the smile that feels like a secret shared between strangers, the way someone's attention can make you feel chosen without either of you speaking a word. But visual connection without physical follow-through exists in a liminal space between fantasy and reality, too substantial to dismiss, but too ephemeral to build upon. The voicemail you didn't save represents a form of technological heartbreak unique to our era. Before digital storage made preservation automatic, keeping someone's voice required intentional action. You had to decide in real time whether their words were worth preserving. The voicemails you saved became artifacts of affection, evidence that someone's voice mattered enough to store against future loneliness. But the ones you didn't save haunt differently, their absence creates a particular kind of regret, not just for the lost words, but for the lost proof that those words existed. You can remember the general content, but not the specific inflections, the way they said your name, the pause before they said goodbye. Memory preserves the meaning, but not the music, leaving you with ghostly approximations of conversations that once felt vital. Voice carries emotional information that text can't convey. The slight tremor when someone says they miss you, the way laughter changes the shape of words, the unconscious intimacy of someone speaking into your ear from miles away, their voice traveling through invisible networks to find you wherever you are. Losing these sonic artifacts feels like losing small pieces of the people themselves. The wedding you weren't invited to strikes a particular nerve because exclusion from celebration feels different from ordinary social oversight. Wedding invitations operate according to complex social mathematics, limited venues, strained budgets, complicated family dynamics. You understand the practical reasons for your absence, even as you feel the sting of not making the cut. Someone you cared about chose their most important day without including you in the equation. This exclusion reveals uncomfortable truths about how others see your relationship. You thought you were closer than you apparently were. You assumed mutual affection that might have been one-sided. You discover that in their mental geography, you exist in a different neighborhood than you imagined. Important enough for casual friendship, but not essential enough for life's milestone moments. Social media amplifies these exclusions by making them visible in real time. You watch the wedding unfold through other people's posts, seeing faces you recognize and faces you don't, trying to decode the guest list's social logic. The photos tell a story about community and belonging that doesn't include you, creating a documentary of your own peripheral status in someone else's important narrative. The silence after they moved on has its own acoustic properties. It's different from the silence of anger or the silence of busy schedules. It's the silence of attention withdrawn, of emotional energy redirected elsewhere. You can sense the shift even before confirmation arrives, the way responses become shorter, less frequent, more perfunctory. They're not angry with you, they're simply done with whatever you represented in their life. This kind of silence forces you to confront the shelf life of your own emotional significance. People who once responded to your messages within minutes now take days to reply, if they reply at all. Conversations that once felt effortless become laboured, requiring more energy to sustain than either party wants to invest. You realise you've become optional in a life where you once felt essential. Moving on operates according to its own timeline, one that rarely aligns with your readiness to be moved on from. Someone can shift their attention, relocate their affection, redirect their future plans without consulting your emotional schedule. They begin new relationships, pursue new interests, construct new versions of themselves that have no space for the person you were in their old life. The asymmetry of moving on creates its own form of abandonment. While you're still processing the end of something, they're already building the beginning of something else. While you're looking backward, trying to understand what happened, they're looking forward, focused on what comes next. You find yourself trapped in emotional amber while they flow like water toward new landscapes. But perhaps the deepest tragedy of love that didn't land isn't the specific instances of missed connection. It's how these experiences teach us to protect ourselves in ways that make future connection more difficult. Each unreciprocated feeling, each misread signal, each moment of vulnerability that wasn't honoured builds small walls around the heart. We become more careful, more guarded, more skilled at emotional self-preservation. This protection is both necessary and devastating. It keeps us safe from the particular pain of unmatched intensity, but it also keeps us safe from the possibility of matched intensity. We learn to modulate our expressions of affection, to hedge our bets, to always hold something back in case we need to retreat quickly. We become experts at loving partially, at caring conditionally, at hoping with escape routes already planned. The cumulative effect of almost love creates its own emotional climate. We develop sophisticated early warning systems for detecting potential heartbreak. We become fluent in the language of mixed signals, skilled at interpreting the subtle signs that someone's interest is waning. We learn to read the weather of other people's affection and dress accordingly. Yet despite all this protective knowledge, we continue to reach toward connection. We continue to hope that the next glance across a room might become a conversation, that the next conversation might become something more. We continue to craft text messages we might never send, to feel our hearts race when certain names appear on our phones, to wonder if this time might be different. Because the alternative to risking unreciprocated love is not loving at all, which represents a different kind of tragedy altogether. So we continue to inhabit the geography of almost love, mapping its territories, learning its seasons, accepting its weather. We carry our quiet heartbreaks like seeds, hoping that someday the right conditions will transform them into something that can grow in two directions at once. Not everything breaks with the sharp crack of sudden impact. Some things dissolve slowly, like sugar stirred into rain, their structural integrity compromised one grain at a time until the moment you reach for them and find nothing but sweetness dissolved in water. These gradual destructions often go unnoticed because they happen at the speed of erosion, wearing away foundations so slowly that we adjust to each small shift without recognizing the larger pattern of collapse. A friendship that becomes scheduling represents one of modern life's most insidious forms of loss. It begins innocently enough, busy periods that require postponing plans, legitimate conflicts that force rescheduling, the natural ebb and flow of life's competing demands, but gradually the friendship transforms from a living relationship into an administrative challenge. Your conversations shift from sharing experiences to negotiating availability, from exploring ideas to comparing calendars. The transition happens so gradually that neither party notices the moment when connection becomes coordination. Text messages that once carried emotional weight now function as scheduling software. How are you becomes when are you free? The relationship maintains all the formal structures of friendship while losing its essential content, like a house where all the furniture has been removed but the rooms remain perfectly intact. You find yourselves perpetually planning to spend time together without ever actually doing it. Each postponed plan gets rescheduled into an increasingly distant future, creating a rolling debt of connection that never gets paid. The friendship exists primarily in the space between arrangements, sustained by the promise of eventual reunion rather than actual contact. You both want to maintain the relationship, but wanting and doing operate in different currencies, and somehow you never accumulate enough of the latter to purchase the time the friendship needs. This scheduling paralysis creates its own emotional weather system. Relief when plans get cancelled because your calendar is overwhelming. Guilt about feeling relieved. Anxiety about the growing distance. More guilt about not making more effort. The friendship becomes another source of stress rather than a refuge from it. Another item on a to-do list that's already too long to complete. A hobby that becomes work illustrates how passion can be killed by professionalization without anyone intending murder. Something you once did for pure joy, painting, writing, photography, music, gradually acquires the machinery of obligation. You start taking commissions, accepting deadlines, optimizing for efficiency rather than exploration. The activity that once provided escape from the world's demands becomes another set of demands itself. The transformation is subtle enough that you don't recognize it as loss initially. Getting paid for something you love feels like winning the lottery of life choices. You've managed to monetize your passion, to turn play into livelihood, to do what you love and love what you do. The dream of every creative person seems to be materializing according to plan. But somewhere in the transition from amateur to professional, from hobbyist to entrepreneur, the relationship between you and your craft fundamentally changes. The spontaneous experimentation that once drove your curiosity gets replaced by the need to produce marketable results. The hours you spent lost in flow state become hours logged for billing purposes. The mistakes that once led to unexpected discoveries become inefficiencies to be eliminated. You find yourself approaching your former passion with the same energy you bring to other work, focused on outcomes rather than process, on productivity rather than pleasure. The creative choices that once felt like authentic self-expression now get filtered through market considerations. What will sell? What will clients expect? What fits current trends? The voice that made your work distinctive gets gradually homogenized by the demands of commercial viability. The saddest part isn't losing the income stream if you stop. It's discovering that you can't simply return to doing the thing for love after doing it for money. The amateur's relationship to the craft, once broken, proves difficult to repair. You've learned too much about the marketplace, absorbed too many external metrics of success to return to the pure joy of creation without audience or agenda. A smile that becomes performance reveals how even our most authentic expressions can be corrupted by repetition and expectation. It begins with genuine warmth, the natural response to connection, pleasure, amusement. But gradually, smiling becomes something you do rather than something that happens to you. You learn which smiles work in which situations, how to modulate intensity for maximum social effect, when to deploy charm strategically rather than spontaneously. This emotional choreography develops its own muscle memory. Your face learns to arrange itself according to social requirements rather than internal experiences. The smile that once reflected joy becomes a tool for managing other people's comfort, for smoothing social interactions, for maintaining the fiction that everything is fine when everything is not fine at all. Professional environments are particularly skilled at converting authentic expression into performative labor. Customer service smiles, networking smiles, meeting smiles. Each situation requires its own calibration of warmth and accessibility. You become fluent in the social languages that smooth commercial exchange, learning to broadcast availability and friendliness, even when you feel neither available nor friendly. The performance becomes so habitual that distinguishing between genuine and strategic smiles becomes difficult even for you. You catch yourself smiling automatically in response to social cues rather than emotional ones, your face operating according to programming rather than feeling. The expression that once connected your inner state to the outer world becomes a barrier between them instead. A yes that turns into quiet resentment demonstrates how accommodation can transform into its opposite, without anyone noticing the conversion happening. You say yes because you want to help, to be useful, to maintain harmony in relationships that matter to you. The initial agreement feels generous, an expression of care and commitment to someone else's well-being or success. But yes requires ongoing consent to remain meaningful, and consent can be withdrawn by circumstances even when it's not withdrawn by choice. The project that seemed manageable when you agreed to it expands beyond its original scope. The favour that was supposed to be temporary becomes an indefinite obligation. The boundaries you thought were implicit prove to have been invisible. Resentment accumulates like sediment in a river, so gradually that the water seems clear until suddenly it's muddy, and you can't remember when the change occurred. You continue saying yes with your words while your body starts saying no. Fatigue, irritation, the way you tense up when certain requests arrive via text or email. The disconnect between your verbal agreements and your emotional reality creates internal turbulence that affects everything else. The person making requests usually has no idea that your yes has become involuntary. From their perspective, you're a reliable, willing participant who continues to offer help when asked. They can't see the internal negotiation that happens before each agreement, the way you talk yourself into cooperation despite diminishing enthusiasm. Your resentment remains invisible until it reaches critical mass and erupts in ways that seem disproportionate to the specific request that triggered the explosion. A relationship that stops holding hands reveals how physical intimacy can evaporate without dramatic cause or conscious decision. Hand-holding is such a simple gesture that its absence often goes unnoticed for weeks or months. You don't decide to stop reaching for each other, you simply stop reaching. The impulse fades so gradually that by the time you notice its absence, you can't remember when you last felt moved to make that particular connection. Physical affection operates according to its own ecosystem of comfort and desire. When that ecosystem is healthy, touch flows naturally between partners, hands finding each other during movies, fingers intertwining while walking, the unconscious choreography of two bodies that enjoy proximity. But when something shifts in the emotional landscape, physical connection often changes first, becoming an early warning system for relational changes that haven't yet surfaced verbally. The absence of hand-holding isn't necessarily a sign of lost love. It might indicate stress, distraction, emotional processing that requires internal focus rather than external connection. But the gap between you becomes a physical fact that your bodies register even when your minds are occupied elsewhere. You sit further apart on the couch, walk with more space between you, sleep without touching. These physical adjustments happen below the threshold of conscious decision-making. Your body simply starts requiring more space, and their body seems to need the same thing. What once felt like magnetic attraction becomes neutral coexistence. You still love each other, still choose each other, still want the relationship to work, but your skin has stopped reaching for their skin with automatic frequency. The joke that stops being funny exposes how humour depends on shared context that can be lost without explanation. Inside jokes are particularly vulnerable because they rely on specific moments, moods, and mutual understanding that can't be reconstructed through explanation. The reference that once sent you both into helpless laughter now requires backstory, setup, a small history lesson about who you were when you first found it hilarious. Humour ages differently than other forms of connection. What seemed clever 5 years ago might feel tired now. What felt transgressive in one context might feel inappropriate in another. The people who found certain things funny together might have evolved into people who find different things funny apart. The joke doesn't become objectively unfunny. It becomes functionally unfunny for the specific audience that once appreciated it. This evolution reflects deeper changes in relationships and individual development. The friends who bonded over shared irreverence might have grown in directions that require different kinds of humour. The couple who laughed at the same things during their early dating phase might have developed different sensitivities, different priorities, different ideas about what deserves laughter versus what deserves respect. A home that doesn't feel like one anymore represents perhaps the most destabilizing form of gradual loss. Home is supposed to be the stable centre around which everything else orbits, the place where you can be fully yourself, where your belongings make sense in relation to each other, where the environment reflects your inner landscape rather than challenging it. But homes can become foreign through changes so incremental that you don't notice the shift until you're already living somewhere that feels like elaborate temporary housing. The furniture that once reflected your taste starts feeling like someone else's choices. The room arrangements that once facilitated the life you wanted to live begin obstructing the life you're actually living. The space that once welcomed you starts feeling like it's tolerating your presence. Sometimes this happens because you've changed, but the space hasn't. The person who arranged those rooms, chose that colour scheme, decided on that furniture layout exists in your past, but you're living in your present. Your current self feels like a guest in a museum dedicated to your former self, surrounded by evidence of preferences you no longer hold and priorities you've outgrown. Other times, the space changes around you. Roommates move in or out, relationships begin or end. Financial circumstances require adjustments that compromise your vision of how you want to live. The home becomes a negotiated space rather than a chosen one, shaped by practical considerations rather than personal desires. You adapt to the changes because you have to, but adaptation doesn't always lead to belonging. A voice you loved that turns into noise illustrates how even the most cherished sounds can become irritating through overexposure or changed circumstances. The laugh that once made your heart skip beats now interrupts your concentration. The speaking voice that once soothed you now grates against your nerves. The specific vocal qualities that once seemed charming, accent, inflection, rhythm, now feel performative or affected. This transformation rarely reflects a change in the voice itself, but rather a change in your receptivity to it. When emotional connection frays, even beloved sensory experiences can become aversive. The brain that once processed their voice as music starts processing it as static. The same sounds that once meant safety and comfort begin meaning intrusion and irritation. The cruelty of this particular change lies in its involuntary nature. You can't choose to find their voice beautiful again through willpower or nostalgia. The shift in perception operates below conscious control in the neurological regions that process sound and associate it with emotional meaning. What once brought pleasure now brings discomfort, and there's no mechanism for negotiating your way back to appreciation. Laughter that feels like effort signals the slow death of spontaneous joy. When amusement becomes something you produce rather than something that overtakes you, the entire emotional landscape of humour shifts. You find yourself working to find things funny, performing appreciation for comedy that doesn't naturally move you, trying to generate responses that once came effortlessly. This effortful laughter often emerges during periods of depression, grief, or emotional exhaustion when the apparatus of joy temporarily breaks down. But it can also develop in relationships where you feel obligated to be entertained by someone whose sense of humour no longer aligns with yours. You laugh because not laughing would hurt their feelings, create awkwardness, reveal changes you're not ready to acknowledge. The performance of laughter requires muscle memory that feels increasingly foreign. Your face arranges itself into the shapes of amusement, while your internal experience remains flat. These sounds you make resemble laughing but lack the involuntary quality that makes real laughter recognizable. You become an actor playing yourself, generating approximations of responses you used to have naturally. Beliefs that no longer fit but you still wear represent perhaps the most complex form of gradual breakdown. These might be religious beliefs inherited from childhood that your adult experience has complicated beyond recognition. Political beliefs that once seemed obviously correct but now feel naive or incomplete. Assumptions about how life works that reality has repeatedly contradicted. The erosion of belief systems happens slowly enough that you can function with increasingly uncomfortable cognitive dissonance for long periods. You continue participating in rituals that no longer move you, defending positions that no longer convince you, identifying with communities whose values you've begun to question. The gap between your public allegiances and private doubts widens until maintaining consistency requires exhausting amounts of mental energy. This intellectual and spiritual displacement creates its own form of homelessness. The worldview that once provided structure and meaning becomes a costume that no longer fits properly, but that you haven't figured out how to remove safely. You're caught between a past that no longer makes sense and a future that hasn't yet crystallized into coherent alternative beliefs. The tragedy of things that slowly break is that they often break so thoroughly that repair becomes impossible. Unlike sudden damage, which can sometimes be fixed by addressing the specific point of failure, gradual deterioration affects the entire structure. By the time you notice the extent of the damage, the foundation itself has been compromised beyond restoration. But perhaps the deeper tragedy is how well we adapt to living with broken things. We become so skilled at functioning despite gradual loss that we sometimes don't realize how much we've accommodated brokenness until something reminds us what wholeness used to feel like. We learn to work around the gaps, to compensate for missing pieces, to find ways to make damaged systems functional enough to serve immediate needs. This adaptability is simultaneously our greatest strength and our greatest vulnerability. It allows us to survive changes that might otherwise devastate us, but it also allows us to accept diminished versions of things that once brought us joy. We become experts at making do, at settling for less, at convincing ourselves that partial satisfaction is sufficient when complete satisfaction has become unavailable. Yet recognizing how things break slowly doesn't mean we should become paranoid about gradual change or try to preserve everything in amber to prevent deterioration. Change is often necessary, even when it involves loss. The friendship that becomes scheduling might need to end to make room for relationships that can be sustained with available energy. The hobby that becomes work might need to be professionally abandoned to restore its capacity for personal joy. The key lies in developing better awareness of gradual processes, learning to notice erosion before it reaches the point of collapse. This awareness doesn't prevent all loss, but it creates opportunities for conscious choice about what to fight for, what to let go of, and what to try to repair before the damage becomes irreversible. We can learn to hold things lightly enough that their inevitable changes don't destroy us, while still holding them carefully enough that they don't slip away without our notice. We can become more skilled at distinguishing between changes that represent natural evolution and changes that represent unhealthy deterioration. We can develop the courage to address problems while they're still problems, rather than waiting until they become tragedies. Because the things that break slowly often break because we stop paying attention to them, stop investing in their maintenance, stop noticing when they need care, They break not from dramatic damage, but from accumulated neglect, from the gradual withdrawal of the attention and energy that keeps complex systems functioning. And perhaps that's the most important recognition of all, that many of the things we lose slowly could be preserved if we learn to tend them more consciously, to notice their needs before those needs become urgent, to invest in their well-being before their breakdown forces our attention. The tragedy isn't that things change, it's that we so often sleepwalk through the changing until we wake up surrounded by the remnants of what we didn't know we were losing. Some losses have no vocabulary, no established rituals, no social infrastructure to support their processing. They exist in the unmarked territories of human experience, where pain lacks legitimacy because it doesn't fit into recognized categories of suffering. These invisible griefs accumulate in the spaces between what society acknowledges as worthy of mourning and what actually breaks our hearts. They create their own weather systems inside us, generating storms that no one else can see coming or understand when they arrive. Mourning someone who's still alive represents one of the most complicated forms of loss because it violates our basic assumptions about when grief is appropriate. The person continues to exist in the world, breathing and making decisions and living their life, but the version of them that you knew and loved has disappeared. They might have changed fundamentally due to illness, addiction, trauma, or simply the natural evolution that sometimes transforms people beyond recognition. You find yourself grieving someone who still has a heartbeat, whose name still appears in your phone, who might even still speak to you occasionally. This grief has no established timeline because there's no official ending to mark its beginning. No one sends condolence cards when someone you love becomes someone you don't recognize. No one brings casseroles when the person you married transforms into a stranger who happens to share your last name. The community support that surrounds conventional loss doesn't mobilize for losses that look like continuation from the outside but feel like death from the inside. The complexity deepens because hope and grief become entangled in ways that make neither emotion clean or simple. Part of you continues hoping that the person you once knew will resurface, that whatever changed them might change again, that recovery or treatment or time might restore them to themselves. But another part of you has already begun the work of letting go, of accepting that the relationship you treasured exists now only in memory. You're simultaneously mourning and hoping, grieving and waiting, saying goodbye and refusing to say goodbye. This dual state creates its own exhaustion. You can't fully commit to grief because they're not actually gone. You can't fully commit to hope because they're not actually here. You exist in emotional limbo, loving a ghost who inhabits a living body, trying to relate to the person they've become while missing the person they used to be. The pet no one knew you had creates its own category of unwitnessed loss. In a world that increasingly struggles to validate grief for animal companions, even when those relationships are publicly acknowledged, the mourning for a secret pet carries double invisibility. Maybe it was the stray cat you fed for years, who never officially belonged to you, but who structured your daily routine around their needs. Maybe it was the office fish that no one else noticed, but whose presence provided you with daily comfort. Maybe it was a wild animal you formed an attachment to through regular observation. A bird that nested outside your window. A dog that belonged to someone else but always greeted you on walks. These relationships develop their own intimacy despite their unofficial status. You learn their patterns, anticipate their needs, worry about their well-being in ways that affect your own emotional state. They become part of your private ecosystem of care, relationships that matter to you even though they don't register in anyone else's accounting of your social connections. When they die or disappear, you lose not just the animal, but the routine, the responsibility, the daily interaction that shaped your understanding of nurturing and being needed. The grief for these invisible pets can't be shared, because sharing would require explaining the depth of attachment that others might find disproportionate or strange. You can't take time off work to mourn a cat that wasn't technically yours. You can't seek comfort from friends who didn't know the relationship existed. The loss becomes something you process in private, another form of secret sadness that adds weight to your emotional inventory without offering any socially acceptable outlet for relief. A miscarriage no one ever heard about carries grief that compounds its own isolation. In a culture that often struggles to know how to respond to pregnancy loss, even when it's shared openly, The miscarriage that remains private creates a unique form of emotional solitary confinement. You might have had reasons for keeping the pregnancy secret: timing, circumstances, uncertainty about how others would respond. But when loss occurs, those same reasons that made secrecy seem wise now make mourning almost impossible. The physical reality of miscarriage can't be hidden from your own body, which continues to process the hormonal and physical aftermath of lost pregnancy, regardless of who knows about it. Your body grieves publicly through fatigue, mood changes, physical symptoms that others might notice, but can't interpret correctly without context you're not ready to provide. You become a walking contradiction, obviously affected by something significant while maintaining the fiction that nothing important has happened. This hidden grief creates its own complications around future pregnancies, relationships, decisions about family planning. The loss that no one knows about becomes a factor in choices that affect other people, but you can't explain your reluctance, your anxiety, your changed relationship to pregnancy and parenting without revealing what you've chosen to keep private. The secret grief influences your present in ways that make it increasingly difficult to maintain its secrecy. A childhood home that was sold without warning represents a particular form of displacement that challenges assumptions about family, security, and belonging. Maybe your parents needed to downsize for financial reasons, or divorced and divided assets, or simply decided they were ready for a different living situation. Their decision might have been entirely reasonable from their perspective, but if you weren't prepared for it, if you weren't consulted, if you didn't get to say goodbye, the loss can feel like a form of emotional homelessness. The childhood home exists in memory as more than just a building. It's the repository of your entire early identity. Your growth chart might still be marked on a doorframe that now belongs to strangers. The tree you climbed might still shade a yard where you no longer have permission to sit. The space that once represented ultimate safety and familiarity has been transformed into real estate, its emotional significance irrelevant to its new economic function. This loss becomes complicated by the assumption that adults shouldn't be attached to their childhood homes, that emotional maturity requires letting go of such connections. If you express sadness about the sale, you might be told you're being unrealistic, overly sentimental, inappropriately dependent on your past. The grief gets dismissed as delayed development rather than recognized as legitimate loss of place and continuity. Losing a community not because of conflict but because of silence represents one of the more bewildering forms of social disappearance. You might have been part of a group, religious, professional, recreational, political, that gradually stopped including you without ever explaining why. No one was angry with you. No one accused you of wrongdoing. No one asked you to leave. People simply stopped calling, stopped inviting, stopped responding to your attempts to maintain connection. You found yourself on the outside of something you thought you belonged to, but the exclusion happened so gradually that you can't pinpoint when or how it occurred. This form of social death is particularly destabilizing because it offers no opportunity for closure, explanation, or repair. In conflicts, at least you know what went wrong and can potentially address the problems. In clear rejections, at least you know where you stand and can begin adapting to new circumstances. But gradual exclusion through silence leaves you in a state of perpetual uncertainty, wondering if you're imagining the distance, if you've misunderstood social cues, if there's something you could do to restore your place in the group. The absence of explanation forces you to become a detective investigating your own social disappearance. You analyze past interactions for clues, wonder if you said something offensive, question whether your presence became burdensome in ways you didn't recognize. The uncertainty makes it impossible to learn from the experience or to prevent similar losses in the future because you never understand what caused this one. The part of you that changed forever after that one night represents trauma that doesn't fit conventional narratives about healing and recovery. Maybe it was an assault, an accident, a death, a betrayal, a moment of profound fear or shame that altered your relationship to safety, trust, or your own body. The event might have been objectively minor, something that others experienced and moved past without apparent difficulty, but for reasons you can't entirely explain, it marked a permanent boundary in your personal history between who you were before and who you became after. This kind of invisible transformation is particularly isolating because the change isn't visible to others and might not even be visible to yourself for months or years. You continue functioning normally, maintaining your responsibilities, showing up for your life in ways that suggest continuity. But internally, something fundamental has shifted. You experience the world differently, more cautiously, more suspiciously, with heightened awareness of vulnerabilities you previously ignored. The tragedy isn't just the original event, but the way it continues to influence your choices, relationships, and sense of possibility long after it's over. You might avoid situations that remind you of that night, decline opportunities that feel too risky, struggle with intimacy or trust in ways that seem disproportionate to your actual life experiences. Others might interpret these changes as personality flaws or emotional problems rather than recognizing them as symptoms of unprocessed trauma. The art project you never showed anyone represents creative grief that carries particular shame because it involves something you made but couldn't bring yourself to share. Maybe it was too personal, too revealing, too experimental, too vulnerable to risk exposing to judgment. Maybe you convinced yourself it wasn't good enough, that it needed more work, that you'd show it when it was perfect, but perfect never came, and eventually the moment for sharing passed entirely. These hidden creations become like phantom limbs of your artistic identity. You know they exist, you remember making them, but they can't contribute to your public creative life because you've kept them locked away. The poems in your drawer, the paintings in your closet, the songs you recorded but never played for anyone. They represent not just artistic output, but creative courage that couldn't quite complete its journey from private expression to public communication. The decision to keep art private might have been protective at the time, but it creates its own form of artistic death. Work that isn't shared can't fulfill its communicative function, can't create connection between artist and audience, can't contribute to the larger cultural conversation. Your hidden creations become evidence of creativity that couldn't quite trust itself enough to risk being seen and potentially criticized. A playlist you can't listen to anymore represents one of the most intimate forms of technological grief. Music has unique power to encode emotional memories, to transport you instantly to specific moments, relationships, and states of mind. The playlist you created for a particular person, period, or purpose becomes a sonic time machine that can resurrect feelings you thought you'd processed or moved beyond. When circumstances change, when relationships end, when people die, when phases of life become too painful to revisit, these musical collections become emotional landmines. The tragedy isn't just losing access to specific songs, but losing access to an entire emotional landscape. The playlist represented not just musical taste, but emotional experience, the way certain songs made you feel, the memories they carried, the aspects of yourself they revealed or celebrated. When the playlist becomes too painful to play, you lose not just the music, but the version of yourself who loved that music, who felt moved by those particular combinations of melody and meaning. Digital music makes this loss more complicated because the playlist still exists, still takes up space in your device, still appears in your library alongside music you can comfortably access. Unlike physical mixtapes that you could throw away or pack in boxes, digital playlists require active decision-making to delete. Many people keep them indefinitely, carrying these musical ghosts through their devices like unopenable time capsules. The meal you only ever cooked for them represents domestic grief that encompasses both the loss of a relationship and the loss of a particular way of caring. Cooking for someone else involves intimate knowledge of their preferences, dietary restrictions, comfort foods, and the specific ways they like to be nourished. The recipes you developed or adapted for their tastes become monuments to a form of love expressed through daily care and attention. When the relationship ends, through death, breakup, or estrangement, these recipes become artifacts of a caring relationship that no longer has its intended recipient. Making the meal for yourself doesn't provide the same satisfaction because its emotional meaning was tied to the act of feeding someone else, of providing comfort and pleasure to a person whose well-being mattered to your own sense of purpose and connection. The kitchen knowledge you developed around their preferences, how they liked their coffee, what comfort foods helped when they were sick, which desserts could reliably improve their mood, becomes useless information that you can't forget but have no reason to remember. Your muscle memory retains the ability to repair food for someone who no longer needs your nourishment, creating a form of domestic phantom pain. A laugh that vanished after someone died represents perhaps the most specific form of grief, the loss not just of a person, but of the particular version of yourself that existed in relationship with them. Certain people evoke specific aspects of our personality, bring out ways of being that don't emerge in other relationships. When they die, we lose not just their presence but our own capacity to be the person we were with them. The laugh that disappears might have been triggered by their particular sense of humour, their way of seeing the world, their ability to find absurdity in situations that others took seriously. Without their perspective to bounce off of, without their appreciation to encourage certain kinds of playfulness, that aspect of your humour goes dormant. You don't lose your ability to laugh entirely, but you lose access to a specific register of amusement that only made sense in the context of your relationship with them. This loss extends beyond humour to all the ways that specific relationships called forth specific aspects of your personality. The intellectual curiosity that a particular friend encouraged, the playfulness that a certain family member brought out in you, the confidence that developed in response to someone's unconditional appreciation. When these people die, parts of yourself that only existed in relationship with them become orphaned, disconnected from the social context that gave them meaning and expression. The cumulative weight of unseen grief creates its own emotional climate. You develop internal weather systems that others can't predict or understand because they're not aware of all the losses you're carrying. Your responses to seemingly minor triggers might seem disproportionate because others don't know about the invisible grief that amplifies everything else. You might need more recovery time, more alone time, more gentleness than makes sense to people who only see your visible losses. This emotional complexity requires a form of self-advocacy that can feel exhausting, constantly explaining your reactions, your needs, your boundaries to people who are working with incomplete information about your actual emotional landscape. You become responsible for educating others about losses they didn't know you'd experienced, grief they didn't know you were carrying, pain they couldn't see. But perhaps the deepest tragedy of unseen grief isn't that others don't understand it. It's that we often don't give ourselves permission to feel it fully. We minimize losses that don't fit conventional categories, tell ourselves we shouldn't be affected by things that don't seem significant enough to warrant mourning. We participate in our own emotional invalidation, becoming internal critics who question whether our grief is legitimate, proportionate, worthy of attention and care. Learning to honour unseen grief requires developing a more expansive understanding of what deserves mourning, what constitutes legitimate loss, what kinds of pain deserve acknowledgement and processing. It means recognising that the heart doesn't only attach to things that society validates as worthy of attachment. We form bonds with places, animals, dreams, versions of ourselves, aspects of other people that might seem trivial to others but that become essential to our own sense of meaning and connection. The invisibility of certain griefs doesn't make them less real or less deserving of care. It simply makes them harder to process because we have to do the work of validation ourselves. Without the support of communities that might not understand what we're mourning, we have to learn to be witnesses to our own pain, to create our own rituals for letting go, to find ways of honouring losses that don't fit into established categories of socially acceptable sadness. This work is both more difficult and more important than grieving visible losses because it requires developing emotional independence, learning to trust your own experience even when it doesn't match others' expectations or understanding. It means becoming fluent in the language of your own heart, able to recognise and name forms of pain that don't appear in any diagnostic manual or grief counselling curriculum. And perhaps that's the hidden gift within unseen grief. It teaches us to become more sophisticated emotional archaeologists, more attentive to the subtle forms of attachment and loss that make up the actual texture of human experience. We learn to notice what matters to us beyond what's supposed to matter, to honour our own capacity for connection, even when those connections seem insignificant to others. The losses that no one else can see become opportunities to develop deeper intimacy with ourselves, to practice forms of self-care and self-compassion that don't depend on external validation. We learn to be our own mourners, our own comforters, our own witnesses to the full spectrum of human attachment and the inevitable losses that come with loving anything at all. The pain of invisibility cuts deeper than rejection, because rejection at least acknowledges your existence. When someone rejects you, they've seen enough to form an opinion, to make a decision, to recognize you as a person worth responding to, even if that response is negative. But invisibility operates in a different register entirely. It suggests that you don't register strongly enough to warrant attention, that your presence makes so little impact that others can look right through you without effort or awareness. Saying "I'm fine" when you're not becomes a daily performance so practiced that eventually you begin to believe your own reviews. The phrase starts as protective camouflage, a way of deflecting concern you don't feel ready to receive or questions you don't have energy to answer honestly. But over time, the performance becomes reflexive, automatic, a social muscle memory that activates before conscious thought can intervene. The tragedy isn't just the dishonesty, it's how the dishonesty becomes its own form of isolation. Each time you say "I'm fine" when you're not, you create distance between your internal experience and your external presentation. You train the people around you to accept surface-level responses, to not dig deeper, to take your word for it when your word is carefully constructed, to prevent exactly the kind of deeper inquiry that might actually help. This protective lying accumulates into a larger problem. You become so skilled at appearing fine that when you finally need help, no one believes you're struggling because you've presented such convincing evidence to the contrary. Your competence at managing appearances becomes a barrier to receiving care. People assume you're handling everything well because you've given them no reason to think otherwise, even when you're drowning in plain sight. The daily performance of fine requires enormous energy that healthy people don't have to expend. You become a method actor playing the role of someone who's okay, studying the behaviors and expressions that signal stability and contentment to others. You learn to modulate your voice, arrange your face, calibrate your responses to maintain the fiction that everything is manageable when nothing feels manageable at all. Being praised for something that drains you represents one of modern life's most perverse forms of recognition. Maybe you're naturally good at organizing things, so you become the person everyone turns to when events need planning, details need managing, logistics need coordination. Maybe you're a good listener, so you become the unofficial therapist for your friend group, the repository for everyone else's problems and emotional processing. Maybe you're reliable under pressure, so you get assigned the most stressful projects, the impossible deadlines, the situations that others can't handle. The praise feels like recognition. People see your competence, appreciate your contribution, rely on your abilities. But the skills being celebrated are often the same ones that are slowly killing your spirit, requiring you to spend emotional and mental energy you don't have in service of outcomes that don't nourish you. You become trapped by your own excellence at things you'd rather not be doing. This creates a peculiar form of success-based misery. You can't complain because you're getting positive feedback. You can't decline opportunities because people are counting on you, praising your unique ability to handle what others can't. Your competence becomes a cage built from other people's appreciation and your own inability to disappoint those who think highly of your particular talents. The drain isn't always visible because the skills come easily to you. Others see effortless competence where you experience exhausting effort. They see natural talent where you feel like you're constantly operating beyond your emotional capacity. The gap between how your abilities appear to others and how they feel to you becomes a source of isolation. You can't explain why doing what you're good at makes you feel so depleted without sounding ungrateful or incompetent. Feeling invisible in a room of people you love might be the loneliest experience available to humans. Surrounded by faces you recognize, voices you know, people who care about you in abstract terms, you can still feel like you're observing the gathering from behind glass, present in body but absent in connection. The conversation flows around you without requiring your participation. The energy builds without your contribution. The shared experience happens without genuinely including your perspective. This invisibility isn't malicious. No one is deliberately excluding you. But somehow you've become optional to the social ecosystem in ways that leave you feeling like a guest at your own life. People are friendly when they notice you, include you when they remember, but you don't seem to be missed when you're quiet, needed when discussions happen, or essential to the group's sense of completeness. The pain intensifies because these are people who would say they love you if asked directly. They'd be surprised to learn you felt invisible, might even be hurt by the suggestion that they weren't paying attention to you. But love and attention operate in different currencies, and you can be loved in principle while being overlooked in practice. People can care about your general well-being while remaining oblivious to your immediate emotional needs. This form of social invisibility often develops gradually as group dynamics settle into patterns that don't require your active participation. You might have become the quiet one, the easygoing one, the one who doesn't need as much attention or maintenance as others. While everyone else was claiming space and establishing their role in the group's emotional ecosystem, you learned to exist in the margins, to be present without being demanding, available without being needy. Watching someone else be chosen again activates a particularly painful form of comparative suffering. The job opportunity that goes to a colleague with less experience but better political skills. The romantic interest who picks someone else despite what felt like genuine connection between you. The social invitation that includes everyone except you. The recognition that goes to someone whose contribution seems less significant than yours. The opportunities that consistently flow toward people who don't appear to want them more than you do. This repeated experience of not being chosen erodes confidence in ways that are difficult to repair because the feedback loop becomes self-perpetuating. Each time you're passed over, you begin to question your own worth, your appeal, your understanding of your own value. You start second-guessing your perception of situations, wondering if you imagined the connection, overestimated your qualifications, misread the social dynamics that led to others being preferred. The cruelest aspect is how often being unchosen has nothing to do with your actual merit or desirability. Choices get made for reasons that have more to do with timing, familiarity, politics, or simple random preference than with objective assessment of worth. But when you're on the receiving end of these decisions, it's almost impossible not to take them personally, not to interpret them as evidence of some fundamental inadequacy that others can see but you can't identify or fix. The cumulative effect of repeated non-selection creates its own emotional weather system. You begin approaching opportunities with preemptive resignation, protecting yourself from disappointment by assuming you won't be chosen rather than hoping you will be. This defensive stance might prevent some pain, but it also prevents the kind of authentic enthusiasm and engagement that actually makes people more likely to choose you. The moment you realize no one asked how your day was reveals how easily emotional labor becomes imbalanced in relationships. You've spent energy checking in with others, listening to their problems, celebrating their successes, offering support during their difficult periods. But somehow the reciprocal curiosity about your experience never materializes. Conversations consistently focus on their concerns, their updates, their needs for processing or advice. This realization usually arrives suddenly, despite the pattern having developed gradually. You're in the middle of listening to someone's story when you suddenly notice that you haven't been asked about your own story in weeks or months. The awareness creates a strange dual consciousness. You're still engaged with their narrative while simultaneously recognizing your own invisibility within the relationship's emotional architecture. The asymmetry might have developed innocently. Maybe you're naturally a good listener, someone who asks questions and shows interest easily. Maybe they're going through a particularly demanding period that requires extra support. Maybe you've become so skilled at focusing on others that they've learned to rely on your attention without thinking to reciprocate. But regardless of how the imbalance developed, discovering it changes your understanding of the relationship's dynamics. The knowledge that no one has inquired about your well-being forces you to confront uncomfortable questions about what you provide to others versus what you receive, about whether your relationships are based on mutual care or simply your availability to care for others. It makes you conscious of the emotional labor you've been providing automatically, without recognition or reciprocation. The way people look away when you cry represents perhaps the most fundamental form of emotional abandonment. Tears make many people uncomfortable because they signal vulnerability that requires response, empathy that demands energy, pain that might be contagious or overwhelming. Rather than risking emotional engagement with your distress, some people simply remove themselves from the equation by redirecting their attention elsewhere. This withdrawal happens in various forms of subtle rejection. The conversation that gets changed the moment your voice cracks. The friend who suddenly becomes very interested in their phone when you start to break down. The family member who physically leaves the room when emotions become too intense. The colleague who becomes awkwardly professional when you show signs of personal struggle at work. The avoidance teaches you to hide emotional expression rather than risk the discomfort of others. You learn to cry privately, to process pain alone, to manage emotional breakdowns in bathrooms and cars and other spaces where your vulnerability won't inconvenience anyone else's comfort. You become skilled at emotional compartmentalization, not because it's healthy, but because it's socially necessary. This isolation during emotional crisis compounds the original pain. You're not just dealing with whatever caused the tears, you're also dealing with the secondary rejection of having your pain be too much for others to witness. The message becomes clear. Your emotions are your responsibility to manage. Your distress is your burden to carry. Your healing is your work to do alone. Not being remembered even by those you remember deeply creates a particular form of cognitive dissonance. You carry detailed memories of shared experiences, conversations, moments of connection that felt significant enough to preserve in your mental archive. But when you reference these memories to the other people involved, you discover that what felt momentous to you barely registered in their consciousness, that experiences you've treasured apparently made no lasting impression on them. This mismatch in memory significance forces you to question your own judgment about what constitutes meaningful interaction. Maybe you're more sentimental than most people, more likely to invest ordinary moments with special meaning. Maybe you're more emotionally sensitive, more prone to forming attachments that others don't share. Maybe you're simply wrong about which experiences deserve preservation in memory's permanent collection. But the repeated discovery that your meaningful memories aren't shared creates its own form of existential isolation. If the moments that feel most important to you don't register as important to others, what does that say about your understanding of connection, significance, shared human experience? You begin to feel like you're living in a different movie than everyone else, paying attention to different details, finding meaning in different places. The asymmetry of memory becomes especially painful in relationships where you thought mutual appreciation existed. Learning that someone has no recollection of conversations that changed your perspective, experiences that deepened your affection for them, moments of connection that you've replayed dozens of times, forces you to revise your understanding of how much you mattered in their story versus how much they mattered in yours. When you dress nice just to be noticed and aren't, the disappointment operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the surface disappointment of wasted effort, the time and energy spent selecting clothes, applying makeup, arranging hair in hopes of catching someone's attention. But beneath that lies the deeper disappointment of miscalculating your own visibility, of overestimating your ability to command notice through appearance alone. This particular form of invisibility cuts especially deep because physical presentation feels like something within your control. Unlike personality, intelligence, or other abstract qualities that might explain why you're overlooked, appearance seems like a variable you can manipulate to achieve different social outcomes. When extra effort yields no increased recognition, it suggests that the problem isn't what you're wearing, but something more fundamental about how others perceive and respond to your presence. The failure of enhanced appearance to generate notice also reveals uncomfortable truths about what actually makes people visible to others. Sometimes it's confidence, charisma, or social skills that can't be purchased or applied like cosmetics. Sometimes it's being the right person in the right moment rather than being objectively attractive or well-dressed. Sometimes it's belonging to social networks or demographic categories that automatically generate attention regardless of individual effort. The disappointment teaches you that visibility can't be manufactured through external effort alone, that being seen requires some combination of internal and external factors that remain mysteriously beyond your ability to control or predict. You can present your best possible version of yourself and still go unnoticed, suggesting that the attention you're seeking might not be available through appearance-based strategies. Being strong for so long that no one asks if you're okay represents the exhausting success of emotional self-management. You've become so competent at handling crises, managing stress, supporting others through their difficulties that everyone around you has developed complete confidence in your resilience. They assume you don't need checking on because you never seem to need checking on, that you don't require support because you're always providing support to others. This reputation for strength becomes its own burden because it prevents access to the care that everyone needs periodically. People don't offer help because they assume you don't need help. They don't ask about your well-being because they assume your well-being is always fine. They don't think to provide emotional support because they're used to receiving emotional support from you, rather than giving it to you. The strength that others admire becomes a barrier to receiving the care you need, but can't ask for without contradicting the image that everyone has learned to rely on. Asking for help would require admitting that the competence others depend on is sometimes performance, that the strength they admire is sometimes exhaustion, wearing a convincing costume. The irony is that your actual strength lies partly in your ability to seek and accept help when you need it, but the perception of your strength makes accessing help more difficult. You become trapped by others' confidence in your resilience, unable to show vulnerability without disappointing expectations that you never explicitly agreed to meet, but have been meeting consistently for so long that others have learned to count on your continued performance of capability. When someone interrupts the one thing you were excited to share, the deflation is immediate and complete. You've been waiting for the right moment to tell this story, share this achievement, describe this experience that felt significant enough to want to communicate to others. You've been holding on to the energy of enthusiasm, anticipating the pleasure of being heard, the connection that comes from sharing something meaningful with people who care about you. But the interruption signals that whatever you wanted to share wasn't compelling enough to hold attention, that the person interrupting found their own contribution more urgent than your complete thought. The moment of excitement deflates like a punctured balloon, leaving behind the flat recognition that your enthusiasm wasn't shared. Your story wasn't captivating enough to prevent interruption. Your contribution wasn't valued enough to receive complete listening. This experience accumulates into a larger pattern of communication frustration. You learn to anticipate interruption, to speak faster, to compress complex thoughts into smaller packages that might survive the attention spans of others. You develop strategies for claiming and holding conversational space that shouldn't be necessary among people who care about what you have to say. The repeated experience of interruption teaches you that your thoughts, stories, and enthusiasm are considered optional by others, that conversations can proceed perfectly well without your complete participation. You begin to edit yourself preemptively, sharing less, risking vulnerability less often, protecting your excitement from the deflation that comes when others indicate through their behavior that what matters to you doesn't matter enough to them to warrant patient listening. The cumulative weight of these forms of invisibility creates its own emotional climate that others can't see or understand. You develop internal weather systems based on constantly managing the gap between how much you matter to yourself and how much you seem to matter to others. You learn to exist with chronic under-recognition, to function despite feeling unseen, to maintain relationships with people who love you in abstract terms but miss you in specific moments. This emotional self-sufficiency becomes both a survival skill and a barrier to deeper connection. You learn to meet your own needs for recognition, validation, and attention, rather than depending on others to notice when you need care. But this independence, while necessary, can also prevent others from learning how to see you more clearly, how to recognize your needs, how to offer the kind of attention that would make you feel genuinely witnessed rather than just generally appreciated. The challenge becomes learning how to make yourself visible without becoming demanding, how to communicate your needs without seeming needy, how to ask for attention without appearing desperate for attention. You have to learn the delicate art of self-advocacy in relationships with people who love you but don't always see you, who care about you but don't always notice you, who would want to support you if they realised you needed support, but who have learned to assume you don't need what everyone needs. Perhaps the deepest tragedy of being unseen isn't that others don't notice you. It's that you sometimes stop noticing yourself. You become so focused on adapting to others' level of attention that you lose track of your own needs, preferences, and emotional reality. You become invisible even to yourself, existing primarily as a function in other people's lives, rather than as a complete person, with your own interior landscape that deserves recognition and care. Learning to see yourself clearly becomes the foundation for helping others see you more accurately. But this work requires developing the courage to be more visible, to take up more space, to risk the vulnerability of asking for what you need rather than hoping others will notice you need it. It means accepting that some people might never see you clearly no matter how visible you make yourself, while others might be willing to see you more clearly if you help them understand what they're missing when they look past you. The goal isn't to become impossible to ignore, but to become comfortable with your own visibility, to value your own attention, and care enough that others' oversight becomes less devastating. When you can see yourself clearly, others' blindness becomes their limitation rather than evidence of your insignificance. When you know your own worth, others' failure to recognize it becomes information about them rather than confirmation of your worthlessness. But this self-recognition takes time to develop, especially when you've spent years adapting to being peripheral, optional, easily overlooked. Learning to matter to yourself as much as you want to matter to others requires unlearning patterns of self-minimization that might have been protective but have outlived their usefulness. It means developing the radical capacity to see yourself as clearly as you see others, to care about your own well-being as much as you care about theirs, to believe that your presence makes a difference even when no one else seems to notice. Survival requires mathematics that no one teaches in school. The constant calculation of what you can afford to lose versus what you need to keep, what you can sacrifice now to preserve what matters most later, what dreams you can abandon to protect the basic infrastructure of staying alive. These transactions happen quietly, often without conscious recognition, as you make small compromises that accumulate into large surrenders. The tragedy isn't that you had to make these choices. It's that making them became so automatic that you stopped noticing how much you were giving away. The dream job you didn't apply for sits in the archive of paths not taken, haunting the edges of your professional identity like a ghost that never got to live. Maybe it was the position at the non-profit that would have paid half your current salary, but aligned with your deepest values. Maybe it was the creative role that felt too risky when you had student loans, a mortgage, a family depending on your steady income. Maybe it was the opportunity that required moving across the country when your life was too tangled with local obligations to permit that kind of geographic freedom. The application deadline passed while you wrestled with practical considerations that seemed responsible at the time, but now feel like excuses you told yourself to avoid the terror of pursuing what you actually wanted. You convinced yourself that timing was wrong, that you weren't qualified enough, that the risk was too great given your current responsibilities. But underneath those rational objections lay a deeper fear that you might get the job and discover that following your dreams was more difficult than fantasizing about them, or worse, that you might not get it and have to confront the possibility that your dreams were never realistic in the first place. Years later, you still wonder what would have happened if you'd been brave enough to apply, if you'd trusted your competence more than your fear, if you'd prioritized potential over security. The job posting exists in your memory like evidence of a road not taken, proof that opportunities for alignment between work and meaning do exist, but require courage you didn't have when it mattered. You tell yourself that other opportunities will come, but deep down you know that the specific combination of timing, circumstances, and readiness that made that position possible was unique and irreplaceable. The relationship you stayed in out of fear demonstrates how terror of the unknown can make the inadequate seem acceptable, even preferable. The partnership that stopped growing, the friendship that became one-sided, the family dynamic that required you to shrink yourself to maintain peace. You knew these relationships weren't serving your highest good, but leaving felt more dangerous than staying. At least you understood the rules of the unsatisfying dynamic. At least you knew what to expect from people who disappointed you consistently. rather than risking the possibility of finding people who might disappoint you eventually. This fear-based relationship maintenance creates its own form of emotional stagnation. You learn to accept scraps of affection, partial commitment, conditional care, as if they represent the full range of what's available rather than recognizing them as evidence of what happens when you settle for less than what you need. You develop elaborate justifications for staying. They need you. You have history together. All relationships require compromise. Better the devil you know than the devil you don't. But underneath these rational explanations lies the deeper terror that leaving might mean being alone, that demanding better treatment might result in no treatment at all. You stay not because you're happy, but because you're afraid that happiness isn't actually available to you, that your current situation represents the best you can reasonably expect, given your perceived limitations, flaws, or general unworthiness of better treatment. The accommodation becomes so complete that you forget what it feels like to be genuinely appreciated, fully accepted, enthusiastically chosen, rather than reluctantly tolerated. You lose track of your own standards, your own needs, your own sense of what healthy relationship dynamics actually look like. The fear that drove you to settle becomes self-fulfilling prophecy as you become less and less capable of recognizing or attracting the kind of treatment you deserve. The city you never moved to represents geographic dreams deferred in service of practical considerations that seemed urgent at the time but now feel like elaborate forms of procrastination. The place that called to you through magazine articles, travel documentaries, friends' stories about their adventures in locations that seemed to offer exactly the kind of life you wanted to live. You researched neighborhoods, calculated cost of living, even visited once or twice to test the fantasy against reality. The desire was real, the possibility genuine, but the logistics felt overwhelming when measured against your current commitments. Maybe you couldn't leave because of job obligations, family responsibilities, romantic relationships that required geographic stability. Maybe the financial risk seemed too great, the professional consequences too uncertain. Maybe you convinced yourself that cities are basically interchangeable, that you could create the life you wanted anywhere if you just tried hard enough to bloom where you were planted. But some places call to specific aspects of your personality in ways that can't be replicated through effort or positive thinking. The creative energy of certain neighborhoods, the pace of life that matches your internal rhythm, the cultural opportunities that align with your interests, the population density that provides exactly the right balance of stimulation and anonymity. You can't manufacture these environmental factors in locations that don't naturally provide them, no matter how much you want to make your current situation work. The city becomes a symbol of the version of yourself that requires specific conditions to flourish. The person you might have been if you'd had access to the right cultural soil, the appropriate social ecosystem, the environmental factors that bring out your best qualities. You wonder who you would have become if you'd been brave enough to uproot your life in service of becoming more fully yourself, if you'd trusted that you could recreate the practical aspects of your life anywhere, while accepting that some aspects of personal development are location dependent. The version of yourself you buried to fit in represents perhaps the most devastating form of survival-based sacrifice. The parts of your personality that were too loud, too weird, too intense, too different for the social environments you needed to navigate successfully. You learn to modulate your enthusiasm, edit your opinions, suppress your authentic responses in favor of presentations that generated less friction, less attention, less risk of rejection or social isolation. This personality management begins early and operates so subtly that you might not recognize it as burial. You learn which aspects of yourself are welcome in different contexts, and which need to be hidden or modified. The family dinner version of yourself, the workplace version, the social gathering version. Each situation requires its own performance, its own editing of authentic expression in favor of strategic presentation. Over time, these edited versions can become so habitual that accessing your unfiltered self becomes difficult even in private moments. You lose track of what you actually think versus what you've learned to think, what you genuinely feel versus what you've been trained to feel, what you naturally want versus what you've been conditioned to want. The authentic self gets buried so deep under layers of social conditioning that excavating it requires archaeological levels of self-exploration. The tragedy isn't that you learn to adapt. Social flexibility is a valuable survival skill. The tragedy is that adaptation became so complete that it replaced authenticity rather than complementing it. You became so skilled at being what others wanted you to be that you forgot how to be what you actually are, so competent at managing others' comfort with your presence that you stopped attending to your own comfort with yourself. The art you stopped making because you needed to pay rent illustrates how economic survival can gradually kill creative expression without anyone noticing the murder happening. The decision seems reasonable, even mature, choosing financial stability over artistic pursuits that don't generate reliable income. You tell yourself it's temporary, that you'll return to creative work once you've established economic security, once you've paid off debt, once you've built enough savings to afford the luxury of following your artistic inclinations. But creative practice operates according to its own rhythm and requirements that don't pause politely while you attend to practical obligations. Skills atrophy without regular use. Creative confidence erodes when not reinforced by ongoing work. The neural pathways that connect you to your artistic instincts can become overgrown with disuse, making it difficult to find your way back to the creative mindset, even when you finally have time and financial freedom to pursue it. More devastatingly, the identity shift from artist to person who used to make art affects how you move through the world, what you notice, what feels possible for your life. You stop seeing yourself as someone who creates beauty, meaning, expression. You stop expecting creativity from yourself. Stop making space for artistic thinking. Stop believing that your creative voice matters enough to prioritize its development over economic concerns. The practical world offers compelling reasons to abandon creative practice: irregular income, social pressure to pursue real careers, family expectations that prioritize security over self-expression. But each accommodation to these practical pressures can feel like a small betrayal of something essential about who you are, what you came here to contribute, what makes your life feel meaningful rather than just productive. The late night studying while your friends lived represents the social sacrifice required by certain forms of ambition, the way pursuing long-term goals can require giving up immediate pleasures and connections, while others were developing friendships, exploring relationships, having adventures. You were in libraries and laboratories and practice rooms, investing in a future that felt important enough to justify present isolation, but that couldn't guarantee the payoff would be worth the sacrifice. This deferred gratification creates its own form of social displacement. You miss the bonding experiences that create lasting friendships, the spontaneous adventures, the late-night conversations, the shared experiences that become foundation stories for lifelong connections. You develop competence and expertise, while others develop social skills and emotional intelligence. You build credentials while they build communities. The isolation compounds because the people who might understand your choices are also too busy pursuing their own ambitions to provide much companionship. You exist in a liminal space between the world of immediate pleasures you've chosen to leave and the world of professional success you haven't yet achieved. The sacrifice feels worthwhile when you're making progress toward your goals, but during periods of stagnation or setback, the cost becomes overwhelmingly clear. Years later, you might have achieved the success you were working toward, but the social skills and connections you didn't develop during your focused pursuit can't be retroactively acquired. The friendships that form during intensive shared experiences, college, early career years, periods of exploration and adventure, have a quality that's difficult to replicate once everyone has settled into the routines of established adult life. Giving up softness to be safe represents one of the most heartbreaking adaptations required by environments that punish vulnerability. You learn to harden yourself against anticipated harm, to develop emotional armor that protects you from the disappointments, betrayals, and rejections that experience has taught you to expect. The softness, your capacity for wonder, trust, openness, spontaneous affection, gets buried under layers of protective cynicism that feel necessary, but that also cut you off from the very experiences that make life feel worth living. This emotional hardening happens gradually, often in response to specific wounds that teach you that openness leads to pain. You get hurt by someone you trusted, disappointed by someone you believed in, rejected by someone you opened your heart to, and you learn to approach future connections with more caution, more skepticism, more protective distance. Each disappointment adds another layer of defensive armour until you're so well protected that nothing can hurt you, and nothing can truly reach you either. The safety you achieve through hardness comes at the cost of intimacy, spontaneity, the capacity to be surprised by joy or connection. You become invulnerable but also unavailable, protected but also isolated. The walls that keep pain out also keep love out. The defences that prevent disappointment also prevent delight. You learn to expect less from people and relationships, which means you also receive less, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of emotional scarcity. The particularly tragic aspect is how this protective hardness can become an identity rather than just a temporary strategy. You begin to see yourself as someone who doesn't need much from others, who doesn't believe in fairy tale endings, who's realistic about human nature rather than naively optimistic. The armour becomes so integrated into your sense of self that removing it feels like losing who you are, rather than returning to who you were before you needed such extensive protection. Swallowing your opinion to keep the peace demonstrates how conflict avoidance can gradually erode your own sense of what you think, feel, and believe. In families, workplaces, social groups, where expressing disagreement creates tension, drama, or relationship threats, you learn to bite your tongue rather than risk the discomfort that comes with authentic disagreement. The strategy works in the short term. Conversations remain pleasant, relationships stay stable, group harmony gets preserved. But each swallowed opinion creates a small internal pressure that accumulates over time. You begin to lose track of what you actually think about things because you're so practiced at considering what you can safely say without causing problems. Your internal voice gets quieter while your diplomatic voice gets stronger, until you become skilled at managing other people's comfort with your presence, but unclear about your own authentic responses to situations. This opinion suppression can become so habitual that accessing your genuine thoughts requires conscious excavation work. You've become so good at considering multiple perspectives, seeing all sides of issues, finding ways to avoid taking controversial positions that your own perspective gets lost in the diplomatic shuffle. You know what will work socially, but not what you actually believe. What will keep peace, but not what you truly feel. What others want to hear, but not what you need to say. The most devastating aspect is how this pattern affects your relationship with yourself. If you can't express your authentic thoughts and feelings to others, you begin to lose confidence in their validity, their importance, their right to exist. You internalize the message that your opinions aren't worth the conflict they might create, that your perspective isn't valuable enough to risk social friction, that keeping others comfortable is more important than expressing yourself honestly. Saying no to what you wanted again represents the cumulative weight of self-denial in service of other priorities that seemed more important, more responsible, more socially acceptable than following your own desires. The concert you didn't attend because you had work to do. The trip you didn't take because it seemed financially irresponsible. The relationship you didn't pursue because the timing felt wrong. The creative project you didn't start because it seemed like indulgent distraction from more practical concerns. Each individual no to yourself might be justified by circumstances, real deadlines, legitimate financial concerns, actual family obligations that require attention. But the pattern of consistently prioritizing everything else over what you want creates its own form of existential deprivation. You become so skilled at self-denial that wanting things begins to feel selfish, impractical, unrealistic, rather than recognizing desire as important information about what might bring meaning and joy to your life. This chronic self-denial can lead to a form of learned helplessness about your own preferences. You stop paying attention to what you want because wanting things you can't have feels more painful than not wanting anything at all. You develop sophisticated justification systems for why your desires aren't realistic, practical, or important enough to pursue, until you lose to recognize and honor your own authentic longings. Letting go of fun to become responsible illustrates how adult identity formation can require sacrificing joy in favour of duty, spontaneity in favour of predictability, pleasure in favour of productivity. The transformation often happens gradually as life accumulates obligations, jobs that require consistent attendance, relationships that need maintenance, financial commitments that demand regular attention, family responsibilities that can't be ignored or postponed. Fun begins to feel like a luxury you can't afford rather than a necessity for psychological well-being. You convince yourself that responsible adults don't prioritise enjoyment over obligation, that maturity means accepting that life is primarily about meeting expectations rather than following desires. You develop pride in your ability to handle serious responsibilities, to make sacrifices for important goals, to put others' needs ahead of your own pleasure. But the complete elimination of fun from your life creates its own problems. Without regular experiences of joy, spontaneity, and pleasure, life becomes a series of tasks to be completed rather than experiences to be savoured. You lose touch with what brings you delight, what makes you laugh, what feels like play rather than work. Your capacity for lightness atrophies from disuse, making it difficult to access joy, even when circumstances would allow it. The tragedy is that fun and responsibility don't have to be mutually exclusive, but the either-or thinking that develops during overwhelming periods can persist long after the crisis that required such extreme prioritization has passed. You continue living like someone who can't afford joy even when your circumstances no longer require such severe self-restriction, because the identity of responsible person who doesn't have time for fun has become more familiar than the identity of person who deserves both duty and delight. The cumulative effect of all these survival-based sacrifices creates a life that functions but doesn't flourish, that meets basic requirements but doesn't provide deep satisfaction. You become skilled at managing practical concerns while losing touch with what makes existence feel meaningful, worthwhile, aligned with your deepest values and desires. The person you've become through compromise might be competent, reliable, socially acceptable, but they might also be a stranger to the person you were before you learned to prioritize survival over thriving. This realization often arrives during periods of transition, after achieving the security you thought you wanted, after the crisis that required extreme sacrifice has passed, after the obligations that justified self-denial have been fulfilled. You discover that you've been so focused on building a sustainable life that you forgot to build a life you actually want to live, so committed to being responsible that you forgot what it feels like to be yourself. The challenge then becomes learning to reclaim what you gave up without destabilizing what you've built, to integrate authentic self-expression with practical necessities, to find ways to honor both your survival needs and your deepest longings. This integration requires courage to disappoint others who have become accustomed to your self-sacrifice, wisdom to distinguish between necessary compromises and unnecessary ones, and patience with yourself as you learn to trust that you can be both responsible and authentic, both practical and true to your dreams. But perhaps the most important recognition is that survival and thriving don't have to be sequential. First you survive, then you live. They can be simultaneous. You can meet your practical obligations while also honouring your authentic desires. You can be responsible while also making room for joy. You can build security while also pursuing meaning. The things you gave up to survive might be reclaimable if you're willing to challenge the either-or thinking that convinced you that sacrifice was the only option. Learning to take back what you gave away requires recognizing that the emergency that required such extreme self-denial might be over, even if your nervous system hasn't received the news yet. It means questioning whether the practical concerns that justified past sacrifices are still valid, or whether they've become habits that no longer serve your actual circumstances. It means being willing to risk the discomfort of others who have benefited from your self-sacrifice, to disappoint people who have learned to count on your willingness to put their needs ahead of your own. The goal isn't to become selfish or irresponsible, but to develop a more sophisticated understanding of what constitutes genuine necessity versus what constitutes fear-based over-accommodation. You can learn to meet your real obligations while also meeting your authentic needs, to contribute to others' well-being while also attending to your own, to be a reliable person who also happens to be a person with desires, dreams, and the right to pursue happiness alongside duty. The human heart seems designed for stories with endings, for conflicts that resolve, for relationships that conclude with understanding, even when they conclude with separation. We expect goodbyes that explain themselves, departures that provide reasons, endings that offer the dignity of knowing why something is over. But some people leave the way seasons change, gradually and then suddenly, without explanation or ceremony, leaving you to interpret their absence without access to their reasoning, to grieve relationships that never officially ended because they never officially began or were never officially acknowledged as significant enough to require formal conclusion. The best friend who ghosted represents one of modern life's most bewildering forms of abandonment because it violates the basic social contract of friendship. That people who matter to each other provide explanations when circumstances change. That relationships built on mutual care deserve more than sudden silence when they need to end. The disappearance happens gradually at first, slower responses to messages, declined invitations with vague excuses, increasing unavailability that seems related to busy periods that never quite resolve into renewed connection. You initially interpret the distance as temporary inconvenience rather than permanent withdrawal. Life gets complicated for everyone periodically, and good friends extend patience during difficult periods, trusting that connection will resume when circumstances allow. You continue reaching out with the same energy and frequency, offering support, sharing updates, maintaining your side of the conversational exchange while waiting for their availability to return. But gradually, the silence takes on different qualities. Messages go not just unanswered but unacknowledged. The read receipts that confirm your communication was received, but deemed unworthy of response. Phone calls that go directly to voicemail without the courtesy of declined notification. Social media activity that proves they're functioning and communicating with others while remaining unavailable to you specifically. The realization that you've been deliberately excluded rather than temporarily overlooked changes the nature of your emotional processing. You shift from patience to confusion to hurt to a form of grief that has no clear object because the person isn't dead, they're simply gone from your life without explanation. You begin the exhausting work of detective investigation, reviewing recent interactions for clues about what might have gone wrong, what you might have said or done to justify such complete withdrawal. This self-investigation often becomes obsessive because the alternative, accepting that some people simply leave without reason, challenges basic assumptions about fairness, communication, and the value of shared history. You analyze conversations for hidden meanings, reinterpret past interactions through the lens of current rejection, search for evidence of your own wrongdoing because blame feels more manageable than bewilderment. A mentor who stopped replying creates its own category of professional and personal disappointment because these relationships often carry aspirational weight beyond their practical function. The person who believed in your potential enough to offer guidance, who saw something in you worth developing, who provided not just advice, but validation that your goals were realistic and your efforts worthwhile. Their attention felt like recognition, their investment in your development like evidence that you are someone worth investing in. Mentorship relationships exist in ambiguous territory between professional networking and personal connection, often developing emotional dimensions that exceed their originally transactional nature. You share not just career concerns but personal struggles, aspirations that extend beyond immediate professional goals, vulnerabilities that require trust in the mentor's continued interest and discretion. Their guidance shapes not just your career decisions but your sense of possibility, your confidence in your own judgment, your understanding of what constitutes realistic ambition. When mentors withdraw their availability without explanation, the loss affects multiple levels of your development simultaneously. You lose practical guidance for navigating professional challenges, but you also lose the psychological support of having someone experienced believe in your potential. Their silence can feel like withdrawal of professional validation, suggestion that their initial interest was misplaced or that your development hasn't met their expectations. The ambiguous nature of mentorship relationships makes their endings particularly difficult to interpret or process. Unlike friendships or romantic relationships, there are few established protocols for how mentorship should conclude, no clear expectations about mutual obligations or communication requirements. You're left wondering whether their silence represents professional disappointment, personal disinterest, or simply the natural conclusion of a relationship that was always intended to be temporary. The parent who never explained creates perhaps the most foundational form of unresolved relationship confusion, because parental behaviour shapes children's understanding of love, communication, and their own worthiness of care and explanation. The parent who left physically or emotionally without providing reasons that children could understand, who made decisions that affected the entire family without including family members in the decision-making process, who maintained silence about crucial family information while expecting children to adapt to changes they couldn't comprehend. This parental silence affects not just the immediate relationship, but the child's developing capacity to understand and navigate relationships generally. Children who don't receive explanations for significant parental decisions often grow into adults who struggle to ask for explanations from others, who accept treatment without demanding understanding, who assume that important information will be withheld rather than shared. They learn to function in relationships with incomplete information, to make decisions without adequate context, to accept others' choices without expecting transparency about the reasoning involved. The unexplained parental departure, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, becomes a template for how significant others might behave under stress. Children learn that people who claim to love them might simply leave when circumstances become difficult, that promises of continued care and presence can't be trusted, that emotional investment in relationships carries risk of sudden abandonment without warning or explanation. Even when these children become adults with intellectual understanding of the complexities that might have driven their parents' choices, the emotional template of unexpected abandonment can continue to influence their capacity to trust others' commitment, to believe in the stability of important relationships, to feel secure enough in love to fully invest in its development. Someone who vanished after saying always represents the particular cruelty of broken promises that weren't intended as lies when they were made. The friend who swore they'd always be there, the romantic partner who promised permanence, the family member who committed to lifelong support. Their disappearance feels more devastating than ordinary relationship endings because it violates specific commitments to endurance, explicit guarantees that suggested their care was durable enough to withstand whatever challenges might arise. These promises of always often get made during moments of intense connection, emotional highs when permanence feels not just possible, but inevitable. The person making the promise believes it at the time, experiences the relationship as so central to their identity that they can't imagine circumstances that would compromise their commitment. The promise feels like recognition of the relationship's significance, validation that the connection matters enough to warrant such absolute assurance. But always promises can't account for the ways people change, circumstances evolve, priorities shift in response to new information and experiences. The person who made the promise might discover that maintaining it requires more emotional energy than they have available, that their capacity for connection has been compromised by depression, trauma, or simply the natural evolution that sometimes makes old relationships feel constraining rather than nurturing. When someone disappears after promising permanence, the betrayal operates on multiple levels. There's the loss of the specific relationship, but there's also the loss of faith in promises generally, in people's ability to honour commitments that extend beyond immediate feelings, in your own judgment about which declarations of love and loyalty can be trusted as genuine rather than temporary enthusiasm. The ex who became a stranger overnight illustrates how intimate knowledge can be retracted as suddenly as it was shared, how someone who once knew your fears, dreams, daily routines, and emotional patterns can decide to treat you as if you're meeting for the first time. The person who once finished your sentences now maintains formal distance in necessary communications. The one who knew exactly how to comfort you during difficult periods now interacts with careful politeness that suggests no memory of your shared emotional vocabulary. This sudden strangerhood often feels more disorienting than anger or hostility, because it suggests that the intimacy you shared was less significant to them than it was to you, that the knowledge they gained about your inner world can be discarded as easily as it was acquired. Their ability to interact with you as a stranger implies that your emotional connection was more surface level than you realised, that their investment in knowing you deeply was more temporary than you understood. The transformation from intimate to stranger also affects your sense of your own privacy and emotional safety. Someone who knows your vulnerabilities, your family dynamics, your professional insecurities, your personal struggles now exist in the world with that information, but without the care that originally made sharing it feel safe. They become walking repositories of your private information without any remaining emotional investment in protecting your dignity or well-being. This retraction of intimacy teaches you to be more cautious about sharing personal information, more skeptical about others' capacity to maintain care for knowledge they've gained about your inner world. You learn that emotional intimacy can be temporary even when it feels permanent, that people can know you deeply without that knowledge creating lasting bonds or ongoing responsibility for your emotional welfare. A friend who became an Instagram memory represents how social media has created new categories of relationship archaeology, where people who once shared daily conversation now exist only as archived evidence of former connection. Their life continues to unfold in photographs and updates that you can observe but not participate in, creating a strange form of one-way intimacy where you know what they're doing but have no role in their experience. This digital distance often develops gradually as real-world connection fades, with social media serving as a buffer zone between active friendship and complete estrangement. You no longer text or call, but you still see their vacation photos, career updates, relationship milestones. You maintain awareness of their life's major events while losing access to their daily thoughts, struggles, and emotional processing. The Instagram relationship creates its own form of nostalgic suffering, because the evidence of your former closeness exists in archived photos where you appear together, smiling, clearly comfortable with each other in ways that now seem impossible to recreate. The visual proof of past intimacy makes current distance feel more dramatic, like looking at photographs of a former self who had access to experiences and relationships that your current self can only observe from outside. This social media archaeology also complicates the grieving process, because the person isn't completely absent from your awareness. They exist in a liminal space where you know too much about their current life to fully let go, but too little to feel genuinely connected. You're neither friends nor strangers, but something in between, observing each other from a distance that feels simultaneously too close and impossibly far. Someone who promised and forgot represents the particular pain of commitments that slip from others' consciousness while remaining vivid in your own memory. The friend who swore they'd help you move, the family member who promised to attend your graduation, the colleague who committed to supporting your project. Their casual forgetfulness of significant promises reveals the mismatch between how much their commitment meant to you versus how much it registered in their own life and priorities. This forgotten promise often hurts more than outright refusal, because it suggests that your needs and their commitment to meeting them weren't significant enough to warrant remembering. If they had declined initially, you could have made alternative arrangements without disappointment. But their promise created expectation and reliance that their forgetfulness transforms into abandonment at the moment when you most needed their support. The forgotten promise also reveals uncomfortable truths about how differently people prioritize commitments, how casually some people make agreements that others treat as binding contracts. You learn that your word and others' word might operate according to different standards of reliability, that promises you would never forget might not even register in others' consciousness as commitments worth tracking or honouring. This experience often makes you more cautious about depending on others' promises, while also making you more conscious of your own commitment-making behaviour. You learn to distinguish between people who make promises they intend to keep, and people who make promises as social pleasantries without genuine intention to follow through. The person who said "I'm just busy forever" demonstrates how polite excuses can become permanent relationship status, without anyone explicitly acknowledging the transition. The initial explanation seems reasonable. Everyone experiences overwhelming periods when maintaining social connections becomes difficult. You extend patience and understanding, expecting that their availability will return when their circumstances improve. But busy can become a permanent identity rather than a temporary condition, a socially acceptable way of maintaining distance without having to explain why closer connection is no longer desired. The perpetually busy person creates a buffer of activities and obligations that makes them unavailable for the kind of spontaneous or intimate interaction that deepens relationships while still allowing them to maintain the fiction that they value connection. This indefinite busyness creates a particularly frustrating form of relationship limbo, because you can't argue with someone's workload or obligations without seeming unsympathetic to their legitimate pressures. You're forced to accept their unavailability, while privately wondering whether their busyness is genuine overwhelm or strategic avoidance, whether they would make time if you were a higher priority, whether their busy life includes leisure time for people other than you. The busy excuse also prevents honest conversation about changing needs or desires within the relationship. Instead of discussing whether the relationship still serves both parties, instead of acknowledging that people sometimes outgrow connections that once felt important, the perpetually busy person uses their schedule as a shield against more direct communication about their diminished interest in maintaining active connection. The one who apologized too late illustrates how timing affects the meaningfulness of accountability, how apologies that come after damage has become irreversible carry different weight than those offered when repair might still be possible. The recognition arrives years later, sometimes decades, when they finally understand the impact of their behavior, the pain they caused, the relationship consequences of their actions or inactions. Their apology is sincere, their regret genuine, but the opportunity for healing and restoration has passed. This delayed accountability often comes after they've experienced similar hurt themselves, after life has taught them through personal suffering what their behavior meant to others. Their apology demonstrates growth, suggests they've become someone capable of recognizing and owning their mistakes. But their evolution as a person doesn't undo the specific harm they caused when they were less developed, less aware, less capable of considering others' emotional experience. The late apology creates complex feelings because it validates your experience, while also highlighting how long you carried unacknowledged pain. It confirms that your hurt was legitimate, that their behavior was indeed harmful, that your interpretation of events was accurate. But it also emphasizes how much time passed while you wondered whether you were overreacting, whether your pain was justified, whether you deserved better treatment than you received. This timing mismatch often reflects different rates of emotional development, different life experiences that teach empathy and accountability. The person who caused harm might have needed years of their own mistakes and consequences to develop the capacity for genuine recognition of others' pain. But your healing couldn't wait for their emotional growth, so you had to process the experience without their acknowledgement or understanding. The one who never did apologize represents perhaps the most challenging form of unresolved relationship hurt, because it requires developing the capacity to find peace without external validation, to heal without acknowledgement, to move forward without closure. The person who harmed you remains convinced they did nothing wrong, or who recognizes the harm but refuses to acknowledge it, or who simply doesn't care enough about your relationship to invest energy in repair attempts. This absence of apology forces you to become your own validator, to trust your own experience without confirmation from others, to believe in your worth without evidence that others recognize their failure to treat you appropriately. You have to develop internal sources of validation strong enough to withstand external denial, self-worth that doesn't depend on others' willingness to acknowledge their mistakes. The lack of apology often says more about the other person's limitations than about your worthiness of accountability, but this intellectual understanding doesn't always translate into emotional peace. You might know logically that their inability to apologize reflects their own emotional constraints, their fear of vulnerability, their limited capacity for self-reflection. But the absence still creates a gap in your experience of justice, recognition, and relational repair. Learning to find closure without apology becomes its own form of emotional development, requiring skills that many people never need to develop. You learn to validate your own experience, to to provide yourself with the recognition and understanding that others couldn't or wouldn't offer, to find peace through acceptance rather than resolution. The cumulative effect of all these unresolved departures creates its own emotional climate, where loss is expected, abandonment anticipated, disappearance accepted as the natural conclusion of human connection. You develop strategies for protecting yourself against the pain of sudden absence, while maintaining enough openness to allow new relationships to develop, despite the risk they carry of eventual unexplained departure. This protective stance affects how you invest in relationships, how much you allow yourself to depend on others' presence and support, how deeply you trust promises of permanence or commitment. You learn to love while holding the possibility of loss, to connect while accepting the reality of potential abandonment, to invest in relationships while maintaining enough emotional independence to survive their sudden conclusion. But perhaps the most important recognition about the ones who left without closure is that their departure often had more to do with their own limitations than with your worthiness of explanation, care, or consideration. People leave without closure not because you don't deserve better treatment, but because they lack the skills, courage, or emotional capacity to provide the kind of honest communication that healthy relationship endings require. This understanding doesn't eliminate the pain of abandonment, but it can redirect it away from self-blame and toward a more accurate assessment of what their behavior revealed about them, rather than about you. The inability to provide closure, explanation, or graceful departure is a limitation that belongs to the person leaving, not evidence of deficiency in the person being left. Learning to grieve relationships that never officially ended, to find peace without apology, to accept love that departed without explanation, becomes its own form of emotional mastery. You develop the capacity to honor what was meaningful about connections that ended badly, to extract value from relationships that concluded without dignity, to maintain your own integrity regardless of how others choose to handle their exit from your life. The goal isn't to become invulnerable to abandonment, but to become more skilled at surviving it, more capable of maintaining your own emotional stability regardless of others' capacity for considerate departure. You learn that closure is something you can provide for yourself, that understanding is something you can develop without others' cooperation, that peace is possible even when justice isn't available. Pain doesn't always correlate with size, and the smallest remnants of lost relationships can carry disproportionate emotional weight, like fragments of broken glass that remain embedded long after the initial wound has healed. These tiny artifacts of former connection possess an almost supernatural ability to transport you instantly back to the raw moment of loss, to make absence feel present, to transform ordinary objects and experiences into emotional landmines that explode without warning. The tragedy isn't that these small things hurt, it's that they hurt so much more than logic suggests they should, creating a geography of grief where the tiniest landmarks can trigger the largest emotional responses. Their toothbrush still in your drawer occupies space that seems both insignificant and enormous, a small plastic object that has become a monument to the daily intimacy you shared. It sits among your own toiletries like evidence of a crime scene, proof that someone else once belonged in your most private spaces, that your bathroom routine once accommodated another person's dental hygiene, that your morning and evening rituals once included the sounds of someone else preparing for sleep or day. The toothbrush represents more than just forgotten belongings. It's a symbol of the assumption of permanence that underlies moving in together, sharing space, integrating daily routines. When someone leaves their toothbrush in your drawer, it suggests they plan to return, that your shared domestic life felt stable enough to warrant leaving personal items behind. Its continued presence becomes a daily reminder of how quickly assumptions about the future can be proven wrong. You can't use it, obviously, but you also can't seem to throw it away. Disposing of it feels like finalizing a separation you're not ready to accept, like destroying evidence of a relationship that meant more to you than its conclusion suggests it meant to them. The toothbrush becomes a tiny shrine to what was, a plastic memorial to the person who once stood beside you at the sink, who once shared your mirror, who once belonged in your most intimate daily rituals. The practical voice in your head argues that keeping it is unhealthy, that letting go of physical reminders is necessary for emotional healing. But the heart operates according to different logic, finding comfort in proof that the relationship existed, that the love was real, that someone once cared enough about returning to leave evidence of their intention to stay. A saved voicemail with their voice becomes a time machine disguised as a digital file, carrying not just their words but their intonation, their breathing patterns, the background noise of wherever they were when they called. Voice recordings have unique power to collapse temporal distance, to make the dead or departed feel momentarily present, to transport you back to the relationship dynamics that existed when the message was recorded. You save it initially for practical reasons. Maybe it contains important information, addresses, dates that you might need to reference later. But as time passes, the content becomes less important than the container, the information less valuable than the evidence that their voice once spoke your name with affection, that they once cared enough to call, that they once existed in your life as someone who would think to update you about their experiences. The voicemail often captures them in a mood or moment that represents the best of your relationship. Cheerful, loving, excited to share something with you. It becomes a preservation of the version of them that you want to remember, evidence that they were once happy to be connected to you, that your relationship once brought them joy rather than the conflict or indifference that characterized its ending. Playing the voicemail becomes a form of emotional masochism, a way of reopening wounds that time is trying to heal. But it also serves as validation that the good times were real, that the love you remember wasn't imagined, that the person who once cared about you enough to leave cheerful messages actually existed, rather than being a fiction created by your selective memory. A birthday they don't remember anymore creates its own annual trauma, a calendar-based reminder that you've been demoted from significant person to forgettable acquaintance in someone's mental database. Birthdays carry emotional weight because they represent the celebration of your existence, recognition that your presence in the world matters enough to warrant acknowledgement, that the anniversary of your birth is information worth storing and acting upon. When someone who once never missed your birthday begins to forget it entirely, the silence speaks volumes about how your importance in their life has diminished. The forgotten birthday isn't just missed celebration, it's evidence that you no longer occupy mental space significant enough to trigger memory, that the date that once seemed permanently etched in their consciousness has been overwritten by new priorities, new relationships, new people whose birthdays now seem worth remembering. This forgetting often hurts more than outright conflict, because it suggests that you've become so irrelevant to their life that you don't even register as someone worth remembering negatively. Anger requires energy and attention. Forgetting requires nothing at all. You've moved from being someone who mattered to being someone who simply doesn't appear in their awareness anymore. The birthday silence also forces you to confront your own expectations about what kinds of care and attention you deserve from people who once claimed to love you. Do former friends owe continued recognition? Do exes have ongoing birthday obligations? The questions don't have clear answers, but the pain of being forgotten suggests that some part of you believed the answer was yes. A song you used to love that now stings transforms music from pleasure into emotional hazard, turning radio stations into minefields where familiar melodies can ambush you with unexpected grief. Music has unique power to encode emotional memories, to become so thoroughly associated with specific people or periods that hearing it recreates not just the memory, but the feelings that accompanied the original experience. The song might have been your song as a couple, the soundtrack to a particular summer, the music that played during important conversations or intimate moments. When the relationship ends, the song doesn't lose its emotional programming. It continues to trigger the same neural pathways that once produced joy, connection or love, but now those pathways lead to loss, absence, or pain. You can't simply decide to stop being affected by the music. The emotional response happens below the threshold of conscious control, in the limbic system that processes memory and emotion before rational thought can intervene. Hearing the first few notes can instantly transport you back to car rides where you sang along together, to lazy Sunday mornings when it played in the background, to moments when the music felt like evidence of how perfectly matched you were. The musical trigger forces you to choose between continuing to listen to songs you once loved or avoiding them entirely to protect your emotional stability. Either choice feels like loss. You lose access to music that once brought joy, or you repeatedly expose yourself to painful reminders of what you no longer have. The song becomes a test of your healing progress, a measure of whether enough time has passed to neutralize its emotional charge. The smell of their cologne in a stranger's coat creates involuntary time travel, demonstrating how scent can bypass rational thought to trigger immediate emotional response. Olfactory memories operate through different neural pathways than other forms of memory, connecting directly to emotional centers in ways that make scent-based recollection particularly vivid and difficult to control. You're walking down the street, riding public transportation, standing in line somewhere when a stranger wearing familiar fragrance passes by, and suddenly you're not in your current location anymore. You're in their car, their bedroom, their embrace, experiencing sense memory so complete that for a moment you forget they're not actually there. The phantom presence feels real enough to make you turn around, to search crowds for a face you know you won't find. These scent encounters often happen when you least expect them, when you thought you'd achieved some emotional distance or stability. The smell ambushes your carefully constructed equilibrium, proving that grief doesn't follow linear timelines, that healing doesn't prevent temporary regression to acute missing. One whiff can undo weeks of progress, can make loss feel as fresh as it did when the relationship first ended. The stranger wearing their fragrance becomes an unwitting participant in your emotional drama, triggering responses they can't understand or anticipate. You might find yourself following them briefly, drawn by the familiar scent even though you know the person wearing it is a complete stranger. The cologne becomes a ghost that haunts public spaces, turning everyday environments into potential sites of unexpected emotional encounter. An email draft you'll never send represents communication that exists in permanent limbo, words that need to be spoken but can't be delivered, thoughts that require expression but have no appropriate recipient. The draft folder becomes a repository for impossible conversations, holding messages that are too honest, too late, too risky to actually transmit but too important to delete entirely. You write and rewrite the email, crafting perfect explanations, apologies, confessions or confrontations that will never reach their intended audience. The writing process provides some relief, putting feelings into words, organizing chaotic emotions into coherent thoughts, saying what you need to say even if no one will ever read it. But the permanent draft status also creates its own frustration, evidence of communication that can't complete its intended circuit. The unsent email often contains your most authentic thoughts about the relationship, the person, the ending. Without the pressure of anticipating their response, you can write with complete honesty about your feelings, your regrets, your anger, your continuing love. The draft becomes a place where you can be emotionally naked without risking vulnerability, where you can say everything without consequences. But the safety of the unsent message is also its limitation. The email can't create understanding, repair damage, or provide closure because it never reaches the person who might benefit from reading it. It exists as a monument to things that need to be said but can't be communicated, to emotional truth that has no outlet, to love that has no recipient. A shared password you still haven't changed represents digital intimacy that outlasts the relationship that created it, access that was granted during trust, but that persists beyond the trust's expiration date. Sharing passwords requires significant faith in another person's discretion and continued goodwill. You're essentially giving them keys to your digital life, trusting them with access to information that could be used to harm you if the relationship turns adversarial. When relationships end, changing passwords should be obvious security protocol, but emotional attachment to shared access can delay practical action. The unchanged password becomes a form of digital hope, a way of keeping doors open just in case reconciliation becomes possible, evidence that you're not ready to completely close off the possibility of renewed intimacy. The shared password also represents trust that felt permanent when it was granted. Creating joint access to accounts, devices, or services suggests a level of integration and mutual confidence that seems stable enough to warrant such vulnerability. Changing the password feels like admitting that the trust was misplaced, that the security you felt was illusion, that the person you granted access to has become someone you need protection from. Sometimes the unchanged password reflects practical inertia rather than emotional attachment. You simply forget about all the places where digital access was shared, all the accounts that still recognize their credentials. But discovering these forgotten digital connections months or years later can trigger unexpected emotional responses, reminding you of how thoroughly your virtual lives were once integrated. A seat at the table that stays empty creates physical space that echoes with absence, a chair that becomes a memorial to someone's former presence in your daily domestic life. Family dinners, holiday meals, regular gatherings that once automatically included them now feature architectural reminders of who's missing. Furniture that serves no function except to mark the space where someone used to belong. The empty seat forces everyone to navigate around absence, to acknowledge loss through the physical environment rather than just emotional processing. Meals become exercises in grief management as well as nourishment. Social gatherings that must account for the gap between who's invited and who's expected, between who comes and who once belonged at the table without question. Family dynamics often struggle with empty seat protocol. Should the chair be removed to avoid constant reminders? Should the place be set out of habit or hope? Should someone else claim the spot? Or should it remain vacant as a form of respect for the absent person? These decisions reveal different approaches to loss, different theories about whether healing requires integration of absence or elimination of reminders. The empty seat also affects the energy and conversation flow of gatherings. The missing person's contributions to family dynamics, their humour, their opinions, their way of mediating or stirring up discussion, create functional gaps as well as emotional ones. The family system must learn to operate without their input, to fill the roles they played in group interactions, to adapt to their silence as well as their absence. A phone number you can't delete represents digital attachment that persists beyond relational relevance, contact information that serves no practical purpose, but that feels too significant to remove from your device. The number becomes an artifact of former accessibility, evidence that this person was once someone you could reach easily, someone whose voice was just 10 digits away, someone who welcomed your calls and responded to your messages. Deleting the number feels like finalizing a separation that you might not be ready to accept as permanent. As long as their information remains in your contacts, the possibility of communication remains technically available even if emotionally impossible. The number serves as a form of digital hope, a bridge that could theoretically reconnect you if circumstances changed or courage developed. The contact often carries emotional weight beyond its practical function because of how it was originally obtained. Maybe they gave you their number with enthusiasm, eager to facilitate continued communication. Maybe it represents a moment of mutual interest, shared anticipation of future conversation. The number becomes evidence that they once wanted you to be able to reach them, that accessibility was freely offered rather than reluctantly provided. Looking at their name in your contacts list can trigger complex emotions, missing them, wanting to call, remembering conversations you had, wondering what they would say if you reached out now. The number becomes a daily test of your emotional progress and self-control, a measure of whether you've developed enough acceptance to resist the temptation to make contact. A nickname no one else calls you represents linguistic intimacy that dies with relationships, special terms of endearment that lose their meaning when their speaker disappears from your life. The nickname might have emerged naturally from shared jokes, physical characteristics, personality traits, or simply from their particular way of hearing and pronouncing your given name. It became part of your identity within that relationship, a version of yourself that only existed in their presence. When the relationship ends, the nickname becomes orphaned language, words that once carried love, affection, or inside jokes, but that now have no speaker and no context. No one else knows its history or significance. No one else has permission to use it. No one else understands what it meant or why it mattered. The special name dies with the relationship that created it. This linguistic loss often goes unrecognized by others because nicknames seem trivial compared to larger relationship issues. But names carry identity, and losing access to versions of yourself that only existed in specific relationships can feel like losing parts of who you are. The nickname represents a way of being seen, understood, and appreciated that no longer has an audience. The unused nickname also highlights the irreplaceable nature of individual relationships. Even if future partners create new terms of endearment, they can't recreate the specific history, humour, or affection that generated the original nickname. Each relationship creates its own language, and when relationships end, some words die with them. The cumulative weight of these small remaining hurts creates an emotional landscape where daily life becomes filled with minor monuments to major losses. You develop strategies for navigating around triggers, for managing unexpected encounters with painful reminders, for protecting yourself from the emotional ambushes that these small artifacts can create. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of these persistent small pains is how they resist the normal timeline of grief and healing. While major emotional wounds often follow predictable patterns of intensity and recovery, these minor triggers can maintain their power indefinitely, ambushing you with fresh pain years after you thought you'd healed from the larger loss they represent. Learning to coexist with these small ongoing hurts becomes its own form of emotional maturity. You develop the capacity to acknowledge pain without being overwhelmed by it, to feel sadness without requiring its immediate elimination, to carry reminders of lost love without letting them define your present emotional state. The goal isn't to become invulnerable to these triggers, but to become more skillful at managing their impact when they occur. Sometimes the small things that still hurt serve important emotional functions, keeping you connected to love that was meaningful even if it couldn't last, reminding you of your capacity for deep feeling even when that capacity sometimes causes pain. The hurt becomes evidence of having loved fully rather than just evidence of having lost completely. The challenge lies in learning to honour what these small pains represent, the depth of connection, the reality of love, the significance of relationships that changed you, without allowing them to prevent new growth, new connections, new opportunities for joy. The toothbrush in the drawer, the song on the radio, the empty seat at the table become teachers about the nature of love and loss, about how deeply we can care and how long that caring can persist, even after its object has disappeared from our lives. Perhaps the deepest grief we carry isn't for what we've lost, but for what we never had. The life that existed so vividly in our imagination that its absence feels like death rather than simply unrealized possibility. These phantom futures once felt so inevitable that we made decisions based on their certainty, turned down opportunities that didn't align with their requirements, oriented our entire sense of identity around becoming the person who would live that particular version of our story. When reality diverges from these imagined narratives, we don't just lose a dream, we lose the version of ourselves who was supposed to inhabit that dream, the identity we constructed around expectations that proved to be mirages rather than destinations. The career path you abandon haunts the professional landscape of your actual life, like a road that runs parallel to the one you're travelling, close enough that you can sometimes glimpse what might have been if you'd made different choices at crucial junctions. Maybe it was the artistic career you set aside for financial security, the academic path you left for practical employment, the entrepreneurial venture you never pursued because the risk seemed too great when stability felt more urgent than passion. This abandoned career exists in your memory not as abstract possibility, but as detailed fantasy that once felt like inevitable future. You knew what the work would feel like, how the days would be structured, what kind of colleagues you'd have, how your identity would shift to accommodate the role. You imagined conversations at dinner parties where you'd explain what you did with genuine enthusiasm rather than diplomatic neutrality. You pictured yourself as someone whose work aligned with their values, whose professional identity enhanced rather than compromised their sense of authentic self-expression. The path you didn't take continues to evolve in your imagination even as your actual career develops in different directions. You wonder where you would be now if you'd been brave enough to pursue the work that called to you rather than the work that paid reliably. Would you have struggled financially but felt spiritually fulfilled? Would you have discovered talents and capacities that remain dormant in your current role? Would you have met different people, lived in different places, become fundamentally different than who you are now? This career grief becomes complicated by success in your actual profession. If you're doing well in the practical path you chose, mourning the artistic path you abandoned can feel ungrateful, self-indulgent, evidence of the kind of chronic dissatisfaction that prevents appreciation of real accomplishments. But professional success in work that doesn't feed your soul can sometimes intensify rather than diminish the grief for work that might have provided meaning alongside achievement. The child you didn't have represents one of the most profound forms of anticipatory grief. Mourning someone who never existed, but who felt real enough in your imagination that their absence creates a specific shape of emptiness in your daily life. This phantom child had a face you could almost see, a personality you'd begun to anticipate, a place in your family structure that remains vacant like a chair set for someone who never arrives. The reasons for not having children vary enormously: infertility, relationship circumstances, financial constraints, career timing, simple lack of desire that surprised you with its permanence. But regardless of the cause, when someone who expected to become a parent never does, they must grieve not just the child they didn't have, but the parent they didn't become, the family structure they didn't create, the legacy they didn't establish through biological or emotional reproduction. This grief affects how you move through a world designed around family units, how you navigate conversations about future plans, how you interpret your own mortality and meaning. The holidays that would have been transformed by children's presence, the traditions you would have established, the ways your own childhood experiences would have been processed and potentially corrected through conscious parenting. All of these remain theoretical rather than lived experience. The absence of children often changes your relationship with time itself. Without the biological urgency that drives many life decisions, without the external structure that children provide to daily routines, without the future orientation that comes from raising people who will outlive you, time can feel simultaneously more free and more meaningless. The years stretch ahead without the clear purpose that parenting provides, requiring you to construct meaning through other forms of connection and contribution. The marriage that never happened exists as evidence of how completely our imagined futures can depend on other people's choices, how someone else's decision about their relationship priorities can dismantle entire life narratives that felt solidly under construction. The wedding you planned in your mind, the house you would have shared, the way you would have navigated holidays and careers and daily domestic life together. These detailed fantasies can feel more real than many actual experiences because you invested so much emotional energy in their development. This particular form of grief often involves mourning not just the relationship, but the social status change that marriage would have represented, the ways it would have affected your identity in professional and social contexts, the security and legitimacy it would have provided in cultural environments that still privilege married couples over single individuals. The wedding that never happened represents a public declaration of love and commitment that remains private, a celebration that existed only in imagination. The unmarried person must often navigate family gatherings, professional events, and social situations designed around couple-based attendance, while carrying grief for partnership that was expected but never materialized. This grief becomes complicated by well-meaning friends and family, who offer reassurance that the right person will come along eventually, not understanding that the mourning isn't for abstract future partnership, but for specific imagined partnership with a particular person who chose differently. The phantom marriage also affects practical life planning in ways that can persist for years. The financial decisions made based on expected dual income, the geographic choices influenced by imagined compromise, the career moves planned around partnership that didn't develop. These practical accommodations to relationships that never materialized can create ongoing complications that extend the grief beyond emotional loss into material consequence. The country you never moved to represents geographic dreams that remain unrealized, places that call to you so strongly that not living there feels like homesickness for somewhere you've never been. The specific location became more than travel destination in your imagination. it transformed into symbol of the life you could live if you were brave enough to make dramatic change, cosmopolitan enough to adapt to different culture, adventurous enough to start over in an unfamiliar place. This country existed in your planning as more than geographic relocation. It represented identity transformation, the person you would become if removed from familiar contexts and social expectations. You researched visa requirements, language learning programs, job markets, housing costs. You imagined yourself navigating daily life in different language, adapting to different cultural rhythms, developing international perspective that would permanently change how you see the world and your place within it. The unmade move haunts your relationship with your actual geographic location, making home feel simultaneously comfortable and constraining. You know the rhythms of your current city, the shortcuts and seasons, the social networks and professional opportunities, but this familiarity can feel like limitation when measured against the adventure and growth that international relocation might have provided. This geographic grief often intensifies during periods of dissatisfaction with current circumstances. When work becomes stressful or relationships become complicated, the country you didn't move to starts looking like the solution to problems that might actually require internal rather than external change. The phantom relocation becomes repository for all the ways your life could be different, better, more aligned with your aspirational identity. The version of you that became a stranger represents perhaps the most complex form of grief, mourning not just unrealized external circumstances, but the person you expected to become through different choices, different experiences, different responses to life's challenges and opportunities. This alternate self had different confidence levels, different skills, different relationships, different ways of moving through the world. They were shaped by experiences you didn't have, relationships you didn't form, risks you didn't take. This phantom self often represents the road not taken at crucial decision points. What you would have become if you'd been more assertive in that important conversation, more courageous in that career opportunity, more open in that relationship possibility. The alternate version of yourself developed through different responses to the same external circumstances, proving that personality and character aren't fixed, but rather represent ongoing choices about how to engage with whatever life presents. Mourning this alternate self requires accepting that every choice eliminates other possibilities, that becoming one thing means not becoming something else, that the person you are represents just one possible response to your particular combination of circumstances, genetics, and social context. The version of yourself that became a stranger serves as a reminder that identity is less fixed than it often feels, more dependent on accumulated choices than inherent characteristics. This grief for alternate selves can become particularly acute during life transitions, when change feels both necessary and terrifying. You become aware that transformation is possible, but that it requires abandoning familiar versions of yourself, giving up known quantities in favour of unknown possibilities. The phantom self represents both inspiration and reproach, evidence that different ways of being are possible, but also a reminder of opportunities that may have already passed. The dream you quietly traded in represents aspirations that got exchanged for more practical goals without formal ceremony or conscious acknowledgement, simply fading from active pursuit until they existed only as nostalgic memory rather than current possibility. These weren't dreams that died dramatically. They were dreams that got postponed indefinitely, set aside temporarily, placed on hold until life became more stable or circumstances more favourable. The trade often happened gradually through a series of small compromises rather than single dramatic decision. The novel got set aside for more urgent writing projects that paid immediately. The travel plans got postponed for career advancement that required geographic stability. The creative pursuits got delayed for family responsibilities that demanded immediate attention. Each individual compromise seemed reasonable at the time, but collectively they redirected your entire life path away from original aspirations. This quiet trading creates its own form of grief because it happens without acknowledgement, without mourning period, without conscious decision to abandon something that once felt essential to your identity. You wake up one day and realize that dreams that used to organize your sense of future possibility no longer feel realistic, that the person who once pursued those goals feels like a stranger you remember fondly, but can't quite access anymore. The traded dream often involved versions of success that don't align with conventional measures of achievement, artistic recognition rather than financial security, adventure rather than stability, creative expression rather than professional advancement. Mourning these dreams requires acknowledging that success comes in multiple forms, that the practical achievements that replaced your original aspirations might represent different rather than better outcomes. A love story that ended in the preface illustrates how relationships can conclude before they properly begin, leaving you with all the emotional investment of deep connection, but none of the shared experience that typically justifies such intense feeling. The person who felt like perfect match but whose circumstances never allowed for actual relationship development, whose timing never aligned with yours, whose interest existed but couldn't translate into availability for actual partnership. This truncated love story creates its own category of grief because you're mourning potential rather than reality, grieving what could have been rather than what was. The emotional investment feels disproportionate to the actual shared experience, but the intensity of connection was real even if the opportunity for relationship wasn't. You carry love for someone who remains essentially a stranger, longing for partnership with someone you never got to know completely. The preface-only love story often feels more intense than longer relationships, because it's preserved in idealized form, never tested against the ordinary challenges that complicate actual partnerships. The person exists in your memory at their most appealing, during the period when everything seemed possible and nothing had yet gone wrong. This perfection makes them difficult to replace because real relationships inevitably involve disappointment, compromise, and the discovery of incompatibilities that phantom relationships never have to navigate. This grief for almost love affects your capacity to invest fully in actual relationships, because some part of you remains attached to the person who felt like perfect match, but who never became available for matching. The love story that ended before it began becomes standard against which other relationships get measured, often unfairly since real partnerships must navigate complexities that imagined ones can avoid. The later that never arrived represents all the postponed experiences, delayed gratifications, deferred adventures that were scheduled for times when life would be less complicated, when responsibilities would be lighter, when circumstances would be more favourable for pursuing what you actually wanted rather than what you felt obligated to do. The family vacation you'd take when work slowed down, the hobby you'd pursue when the children were older, the friendship you'd revive when life became less demanding. This phantom later exists in your planning as solution to current constraints, the time when you'll finally do all the things you're putting off for more urgent priorities, but later often arrives looking different than expected, with new responsibilities that replace old ones, new constraints that substitute for resolved ones, new reasons why now still isn't the right time for whatever you've been postponing. The delayed experiences often lose their appeal by the time circumstances would finally allow them. The energy required for adventure diminishes with age. The friends you plan to reconnect with have moved on to different life phases. The dreams you deferred have been superseded by new dreams that seem more appropriate to your current self. The later that was supposed to provide opportunity for postponed experiences becomes too late for the person who originally wanted those experiences. This grief for unlived life affects how you approach current opportunities, making you more aware of the cost of deferring pleasure, more conscious of how quickly circumstances change in ways that make previous dreams irrelevant or impossible. The recognition that later might never arrive can motivate more immediate pursuit of what matters, but it can also create anxiety about making wrong choices, missing opportunities, failing to prioritize appropriately among competing demands. The reunion that stayed a fantasy exists in imagination as reconciliation that would restore severed relationships, heal old wounds, provide closure to unfinished emotional business with family members, friends, romantic partners whose presence you miss despite the reasons that made distance necessary or inevitable. The fantasy reunion resolves conflicts that real-world attempts at communication haven't managed to address, provides apologies that haven't been offered, creates understanding that actual conversations haven't achieved. This imagined reconciliation often involves versions of other people, who are more receptive, more evolved, more capable of acknowledgement and growth than they've demonstrated in reality. In the fantasy, they're able to see your perspective, admit their mistakes, express regret for harm they caused. They've developed emotional skills that allow them to engage in the kind of conversation that could actually repair relationship damage rather than creating additional hurt. The persistent appeal of reunion fantasy suggests that some relationships leave business so unfinished that imagination continues working on solutions long after practical efforts have been exhausted. The fantasy provides what reality couldn't: satisfaction of longing for connection with people who matter to you, but who aren't available for the kind of relationship that could provide that connection. This ongoing fantasy can prevent full acceptance of relationship limitations, keeping hope alive for reconciliation that might not be possible or healthy. But it can also provide important information about what kinds of closure you need, what kinds of conversation would help you find peace, what aspects of ended relationships continue to require attention and processing. The life you mourn even while living this one represents the deepest form of existential grief. The recognition that choosing one path means foreclosing others, that living any particular life means not living infinite alternative lives that might have been equally valid, meaningful, or fulfilling. This isn't dissatisfaction with your actual circumstances so much as awareness of the weight of choice, the responsibility of having created this specific existence when other existences were possible. This grief for unlived lives becomes particularly acute during periods of major life evaluation, milestone birthdays, career transitions, relationship changes, health crises that force reflection on how time has been spent and how remaining time might be used. The awareness that life is finite makes every choice significant, because choosing anything means not choosing everything else. The mourning for parallel lives doesn't necessarily indicate that wrong choices were made. It might simply reflect the human capacity to imagine multiple forms of fulfillment, multiple ways of finding meaning, multiple versions of happiness that can't all be pursued simultaneously. The life you're living might be exactly the right life for you, while still leaving room for grief about the lives you didn't live. This existential mourning can provide valuable information about what's missing from your current life, what unexpressed aspects of yourself might still be integrated into your actual circumstances, what dreams might still be approachable even if they can't be pursued in their original form. The life you mourn might contain elements that could be incorporated into the life you're living, making the grief productive rather than simply nostalgic. But perhaps the most important recognition about the life you imagined that never came true is that imagination itself served important functions, even when its specific content didn't materialize. The dreams provided hope during difficult periods, motivation for making changes, vision of what might be possible when current circumstances felt limiting. The imagined futures taught you about your own values, desires, priorities, even when they didn't become actual futures. The gap between imagined and actual life creates space for ongoing dreaming, for continued growth, for recognition that life remains open to possibility, even when specific possibilities have been foreclosed. The life you didn't live becomes teacher about the life you are living, reminder that meaning comes not just from achieving specific goals, but from the ongoing process of imagining, choosing, adapting, and choosing again. Learning to grieve unlived lives while remaining open to life as it actually unfolds becomes its own form of wisdom. Accepting limitation while maintaining possibility, honouring what didn't happen while staying present to what is happening, carrying sadness for roads not taken while remaining curious about where current roads might lead. The phantom futures become part of the actual present, informing but not dominating decisions about how to live with conscious awareness of all that any single life must sacrifice to become itself, after cataloguing all the ways life disappoints, wounds, and diminishes us. After acknowledging the 1,000 small deaths that occur within the boundaries of ordinary existence, there remains something remarkable about the human capacity to persist. Not the dramatic resilience celebrated in movies or motivational speeches, but the quiet, unglamorous determination that gets you through Tuesday afternoons when nothing feels meaningful, Wednesday mornings when you can't remember why you thought your goals were worth pursuing, Thursday evenings when you're too tired to care about anything but survival, until the next day arrives with its identical demands. This strength isn't inspirational in the conventional sense. It doesn't overcome obstacles so much as learn to carry them. It doesn't transform pain into wisdom so much as find ways to function despite ongoing hurt. It doesn't achieve victory over circumstances so much as develop stamina for enduring whatever circumstances continue to arise. This is the strength of people who have been broken, but who continue to show up, who have lost faith, but who continue to act as if hope might return, who have stopped believing that life will get easier, but who refuse to stop trying to make it meaningful. Waking up the day after heartbreak represents perhaps the most fundamental form of quiet heroism, because it requires choosing consciousness when unconsciousness would be more comfortable, selecting presence when absence would be less painful, deciding to engage with reality when fantasy would be more appealing. The morning after someone leaves, after the diagnosis arrives, after the dream collapses, after the betrayal becomes impossible to deny, you wake up anyway. Your body performs the biological functions that constitute living, while your heart performs the more complicated work of learning to carry loss without being crushed by its weight. This daily choice to continue existing doesn't happen once. It happens repeatedly, morning after morning, until eventually the choice becomes habit, and the habit becomes identity, and you discover that you've become someone who knows how to live with profound disappointment without letting it destroy your capacity for engagement with whatever possibilities remain. The strength isn't in the dramatic moment of crisis, but in the accumulated decision to keep choosing life when life keeps presenting evidence that it might not be worth the effort. The morning routine becomes sacred during these periods, not because it provides joy, but because it provides structure, evidence that you can still perform the basic maintenance required by human existence, even when human existence feels overwhelming. Making coffee, brushing teeth, choosing clothes to wear to jobs you might not care about anymore. These small acts become proof of your continued capacity to function, evidence that whatever has been broken in you hasn't eliminated your ability to meet the minimum requirements of participating in the world. But the real heroism lies not in maintaining external appearances, but in the internal work of continuing to hope that the day might contain something worthwhile, that the future might improve, that your presence in the world might matter to someone even when it doesn't feel like it matters to you. This hope doesn't require optimism, it only requires willingness to find out what happens next, curiosity about whether tomorrow might feel different from today. Smiling at work while breaking inside demonstrates the sophisticated emotional labour required to maintain professional function, while processing personal crisis, to meet social expectations for pleasantness and productivity while your internal world undergoes reconstruction. The workplace demands consistent performance regardless of your emotional state, requiring you to separate private suffering from public contribution, to show up as a competent colleague even when you feel like a barely functional human being. This compartmentalization becomes its own form of strength, not because hiding pain is admirable, but because maintaining the ability to contribute to shared goals while managing individual struggle demonstrates remarkable emotional sophistication. You learn to hold multiple realities simultaneously, the reality of your private pain and the reality of your public responsibilities, the truth of your internal experience and the requirements of external engagement. The smile at work isn't deception, it's adaptation. It's recognizing that your colleagues didn't cause your pain and shouldn't be responsible for managing it, that your professional environment functions better when people can focus on shared objectives rather than individual emotional processing, that maintaining normal workplace interactions provides stability during periods when everything else feels chaotic. But the strength required for this daily performance shouldn't be underestimated. It takes tremendous energy to translate internal turmoil into external functionality, to access the parts of yourself that can still engage meaningfully with tasks and people when other parts feel damaged beyond repair. This emotional translation work happens below the threshold of recognition. Others see competence where you experience exhaustion, capability where you feel depletion. The smile becomes evidence of your capacity to care about things beyond your own immediate emotional needs, to recognize that life contains responsibilities that transcend personal feelings. That contribution to something larger than individual experience can provide meaning even when individual experience feels meaningless. The work performance maintained during crisis becomes proof that you're still connected to purpose even when purpose feels distant. Taking care of others when no one took care of you reveals perhaps the most profound form of strength, because it requires generating care from internal resources when external resources have been depleted, creating for others what you needed but didn't receive, providing support that you understand the value of precisely because you experienced its absence. This care might be directed toward children, aging parents, friends in crisis, colleagues under pressure, or simply strangers who need assistance that you're positioned to provide. The decision to care for others despite your own unmet needs doesn't come from martyrdom or self-sacrifice. It comes from recognition that care is valuable, regardless of whether it's reciprocated, that kindness creates meaning even when it's not acknowledged, that your capacity to provide what you didn't receive proves that cycles of neglect don't have to be perpetual. You become someone who breaks patterns rather than perpetuating them. This strength appears in countless daily interactions. The patience you show with difficult people, because you remember what it felt like to be difficult and alone. The extra effort you make to include others, because you remember the pain of exclusion. The way you listen carefully to people's problems, because you remember how it felt to speak into silence. Your own experience of lacking care becomes education in how to provide care, training in recognizing needs that others might miss. The care you provide without having received it also demonstrates your ability to imagine better ways of treating people, to envision more generous forms of human interaction, to create the kind of community you wish you'd had access to during your own periods of need. You become a source of what you wished someone had been for you. Evidence that people can develop wisdom from wounds rather than just bitterness from betrayal. But perhaps most importantly, caring for others when you weren't cared for proves that your capacity for love wasn't destroyed by not being loved adequately, that your understanding of kindness wasn't eliminated by experiencing cruelty, that your ability to see and respond to others' needs wasn't diminished by having your own needs go unrecognized. The love you give becomes evidence of love's resilience, proof that care can be generated internally rather than only received externally. Letting go with grace, even when you didn't want to, demonstrates strength that operates against natural impulses toward clinging, control, and resistance to unwanted change. This grace appears in countless forms: accepting job losses without bitterness, allowing relationships to end without manipulation, watching children grow up and away without possessiveness, facing health declines without rage, acknowledging aging without desperation to reverse natural processes. This graceful release doesn't mean you wanted the losses or felt ready for the changes. It means you recognize that wanting and readiness aren't prerequisites for change, that life will continue its transformations regardless of your preferences, that fighting inevitable changes wastes energy that could be redirected toward adapting to new circumstances. Grace becomes a form of practical wisdom rather than spiritual achievement. The strength required for graceful letting go comes from developing trust in your own adaptability, confidence that you can learn to live with whatever losses occur, faith that meaning can be found in new circumstances even when you preferred old ones. This trust isn't naive optimism, it's earned confidence based on evidence of your own resilience, your own capacity to survive unwanted changes, and eventually find value in unexpected situations. Graceful letting go also requires distinguishing between what you can control and what you can't, developing the emotional maturity to invest energy only in areas where your effort can make a difference. This discrimination becomes a form of self-care, preventing the exhaustion that comes from fighting battles that can't be won while preserving energy for battles that might be winnable. The grace appears not in the absence of grief, but in your willingness to grieve completely while still engaging with whatever comes next. You learn to feel sad about losses without letting sadness prevent engagement with new possibilities, to honour what was while remaining open to what might be, to mourn endings while staying curious about beginnings. Choosing peace instead of revenge demonstrates strength that requires overriding natural impulses toward retaliation, justice-seeking, and evening scores with people who have caused harm. This choice often gets misinterpreted as weakness or passivity, but it actually requires tremendous internal power to resist the temporary satisfaction of hurting people who hurt you in favour of the longer-term benefits of maintaining your own integrity and emotional health. The decision to choose peace doesn't mean approving of harmful behaviour or excusing people from accountability. It means recognising that revenge rarely provides the satisfaction it promises, that carrying anger and resentment damages you more than it damages the people who hurt you, that your energy is better invested in building positive future experiences rather than trying to balance past negative ones. This choice often requires grieving the fantasy of perfect justice, accepting that people who harmed you might never face consequences that match the damage they caused, acknowledging that life isn't fair and that waiting for fairness to arrive might prevent you from creating whatever satisfaction and meaning are actually available to you. Peace becomes a practical choice rather than a moral obligation. The strength to choose peace also comes from understanding that revenge keeps you connected to people and situations that harmed you, forces you to continue engaging with toxicity in pursuit of resolution that might never arrive. Choosing peace allows you to redirect attention toward people and activities that nurture rather than drain you, relationships that contribute to your well-being rather than threatening it. But perhaps most importantly, choosing peace demonstrates faith in your own capacity to create satisfaction through positive action, rather than through negative reaction, confidence that you can build meaningful life experiences through construction rather than destruction, trust that your future well-being doesn't depend on balancing past wrongs, but on making present choices that align with your deepest values. Going to therapy even when it terrified you represents courage that operates against shame, stigma, and fear of vulnerability to seek help that you recognized you needed despite social pressure to handle problems independently. This strength appears in making the initial call to schedule an appointment, in showing up to the first session, in returning week after week, even when the process feels uncomfortable or progress seems minimal. The decision to seek therapy often requires overcoming internal resistance as well as external judgment. Admitting that you can't solve your problems alone, acknowledging that you need assistance with emotional regulation or relationship skills, accepting that professional help might provide insights that you can't generate through willpower or self-reflection alone. This admission isn't weakness, it's accurate assessment of your needs and realistic evaluation of available resources. The therapeutic process itself requires tremendous courage because it involves examining parts of yourself and your history that you might prefer to avoid, discussing experiences that feel shameful or painful, developing awareness of patterns that you've been unconsciously perpetuating. Therapy asks you to become curious about aspects of your experience that might be easier to ignore, to develop vocabulary for feelings you've never named, to consider possibilities for change that feel both exciting and terrifying. The strength to continue therapy even when it becomes difficult, when insights challenge your self-perception, when progress feels slow, when sessions leave you emotionally exhausted, demonstrates commitment to growth that operates against natural preferences for comfort and familiarity. You choose discomfort in service of development, vulnerability in pursuit of authentic connection, honesty despite the relief that might come from continued self-deception. Perhaps most importantly, seeking therapy demonstrates faith that change is possible, that patterns can be interrupted, that your future doesn't have to be determined by your past. This faith requires strength, because it operates against evidence of repeated difficulties, failed attempts at change, cycles that have seemed unbreakable. Therapy becomes an act of hope as much as healing. Starting over again represents perhaps the most exhausting form of strength, because it requires summoning energy for new beginnings, when previous beginnings have led to disappointment, mustering enthusiasm for fresh starts when fresh starts have repeatedly failed to provide lasting satisfaction, finding motivation to build when building has resulted in structures that eventually collapsed. This strength appears in countless life transitions, moving to new cities after previous moves didn't provide what you hoped for, entering new relationships after previous relationships ended painfully, pursuing new career directions after previous career changes failed to create fulfillment, attempting new creative projects after previous creative efforts were abandoned or rejected. Starting over requires developing comfort with not knowing how things will turn out, accepting that effort doesn't guarantee success, recognizing that your best attempts might still result in failure, but that attempting nothing guarantees stagnation. This comfort with uncertainty becomes its own form of courage, willingness to risk disappointment in pursuit of possibilities that can only be discovered through action. The strength to start over also comes from learning to value process over outcome, to find satisfaction in the act of trying rather than only in the results of trying, to appreciate your own courage and effort regardless of whether they produce the specific changes you're seeking. Starting over becomes evidence of your refusal to accept current circumstances as permanent, proof of your continued belief that life can be different even when previous evidence suggests otherwise. But perhaps most importantly, starting over demonstrates your capacity to learn from failure without being defeated by it, to extract wisdom from disappointment without becoming cynical, to maintain hope despite repeated evidence that hope is risky. Each new beginning becomes testimony to your resilience, evidence that you can survive the collapse of plans and still generate energy for new plans. Carrying grief like a second heartbeat without letting it stop the first one might be the most sophisticated strength of all, because it requires learning to coexist with pain rather than eliminating it, developing the capacity to function fully while bearing losses that never completely heal, integrating sadness into the architecture of daily life without letting sadness become the only structural element. This strength appears in people who have lost children but continue to parent other children, who have lost partners but continue to seek love, who have experienced trauma but continue to trust, who have faced betrayal but continue to form friendships. The grief doesn't disappear, it becomes part of the rhythm of their existence, present but not overwhelming, acknowledged but not consuming. Learning to carry grief well requires developing emotional sophistication that recognizes sadness as one element of human experience rather than evidence that life has been ruined, accepting that pain can coexist with joy without negating either experience, understanding that healing doesn't mean forgetting, but rather means developing the capacity to remember without being destroyed by memory. This grief-carrying strength also demonstrates profound acceptance of life's basic terms and conditions, that love involves risk of loss, that investment in anything meaningful makes you vulnerable to disappointment, that caring deeply about people and goals creates the possibility of deep hurt when people leave or goals fail. Carrying grief well means accepting these risks as the price of full engagement with life, rather than trying to protect yourself through emotional numbing or withdrawal. Perhaps most remarkably, people who carry grief well often become sources of comfort for others, experiencing loss because they've learned that grief can be survived, that pain doesn't have to be permanent, that life can continue to contain meaning even after it's contained profound disappointment. Their own experience of surviving loss becomes evidence that survival is possible, hope that others can also learn to integrate loss without being destroyed by it, still hoping even after everything represents the most mysterious form of strength because it operates against accumulated evidence that hope is often disappointed, that expectations frequently lead to frustration, that optimism about the future is regularly proven naive by actual future developments. This hope isn't based on logical analysis of probability. It's based on recognition that giving up hope would be a form of dying while still alive, that cynicism provides protection but eliminates possibility. The hope that persists after disappointment isn't the same as original hope. It's more complex, more realistic, more aware of potential failure but still committed to potential success. This mature hope operates with full knowledge of life's capacity for cruelty, while maintaining faith in its capacity for beauty, accepting that both experiences are inevitable, while choosing to orient toward beauty when possible. This hoping strength appears in people who continue to apply for jobs after repeated rejections, who continue to seek treatment for chronic illnesses that might never be cured, who continue to work towards social change despite slow progress, who continue to reach toward love despite having been hurt by previous attempts at connection. Their hope becomes evidence of their refusal to let experience determine identity, their insistence that past failures don't eliminate future possibilities. Perhaps most importantly, continued hope demonstrates recognition that the alternative to hoping, resignation, cynicism, despair, doesn't actually protect you from disappointment, but does prevent you from accessing whatever joy, connection, or meaning might still be available. Hope becomes a practical choice rather than an emotional luxury, a strategy for remaining open to unexpected positive developments, rather than a naive belief that positive developments are guaranteed. Living with quiet tragedy while loving anyway might be the ultimate form of human strength, because it requires maintaining capacity for affection, care, and commitment. Despite having learned how easily affection can be withdrawn, care can be abandoned, and commitment can be broken. This love operates with full knowledge of love's risks while choosing to take those risks anyway, understanding that protection from hurt also means protection from joy. This strength appears in people who form new friendships after being betrayed by old friends, who continue to care for family members who have disappointed them, who maintain professional dedication despite working in systems that don't appreciate their contribution, who invest in community despite living in communities that often fail to support their needs. Their love becomes evidence of love's resilience rather than evidence of their naivety. The decision to love anyway doesn't mean ignoring red flags or accepting poor treatment. It means maintaining the capacity to recognize and respond to genuine care when it appears, developing wisdom about where to invest emotional energy while preserving the ability to invest when appropriate conditions arise. This discriminating love becomes more valuable rather than less valuable, because it's offered consciously rather than automatically. Perhaps most remarkably, people who continue loving after being hurt often love more skillfully than people who haven't been tested by loss, because they understand both love's value and its fragility, both its power to heal and its capacity to wound. Their love is educated by experience, informed by reality, strengthened rather than weakened by their knowledge of what can go wrong. The quiet strength that enables continued loving after experiencing tragedy isn't about forgetting pain or pretending damage didn't occur. It's about integration, about learning to hold love and loss simultaneously, about developing the emotional sophistication to appreciate beauty while acknowledging danger, to invest in relationships while maintaining the independence necessary to survive if those relationships end. And perhaps this is what all quiet strength ultimately represents. Not the elimination of vulnerability, but the willingness to remain vulnerable anyway. Not the achievement of safety, but the courage to engage with danger when engagement serves values larger than self-protection. Not the guarantee of success, but the commitment to keep trying despite repeated evidence that trying doesn't guarantee results. The quiet strength that gets you through ordinary days filled with extraordinary pain, that enables continued functioning despite profound loss, that sustains hope despite accumulated disappointment. This strength doesn't announce itself with fanfare or seek recognition for its achievements. It simply shows up, day after day, making possible the continuation of life even when life feels impossible to continue. This strength belongs to everyone who has ever chosen to get up after being knocked down, who has ever decided to try again after failing, who has ever maintained kindness despite experiencing cruelty, who has ever preserved hope despite encountering despair. It's the strength of ordinary people doing the extraordinary work of remaining human, under conditions that sometimes make humanity feel like an impossible burden rather than a precious gift. But it is a gift. This capacity to endure without becoming bitter, to survive without becoming cruel, to continue without becoming mechanical. The quiet strength that carries you through life's inevitable tragedies, while preserving your ability to recognize and create beauty, demonstrates the fundamental resilience that makes human existence remarkable, rather than merely possible. It proves that people can be broken without being destroyed, wounded without being defeated, disappointed without losing the capacity for wonder. This is the strength that no one celebrates but everyone depends on, the resilience that gets no recognition but makes all other achievements possible, the endurance that creates no headlines but sustains the basic infrastructure of human civilization. It's the quiet heroism of continuing to care when caring hurts, continuing to try when trying has failed, continuing to love when love has been lost. And in a world filled with quiet tragedies, this quiet strength might be the most beautiful tragedy of all. That people can experience so much pain and still choose to be gentle, can face so much loss and still choose to be generous, can endure so much disappointment and still choose to hope. The strength that emerges from surviving tragedy while remaining capable of love proves that human beings contain something indestructible, something that can be damaged but not eliminated, something that can be tested but not ultimately defeated. This is the quiet strength that keeps the world turning, hearts beating, people caring for each other despite every reason to stop. It's the strength you've been developing all along, through every quiet tragedy you've survived, every small loss you've integrated, every day you've chosen to keep going when going seemed pointless. It's the strength that proves that, even in a world full of things that break, something in the human spirit remains unbreakable, something that continues to reach toward light even in the deepest darkness, something that insists on hope even when hope seems naive, something that chooses love even when love seems dangerous. This strength is yours. It has always been yours. And as long as you keep using it, as long as you keep choosing to continue, as long as you keep reaching toward whatever small joys and connections remain available, the quiet tragedies become part of a larger story. Not a story of defeat, but a story of remarkable, quiet, persistent, beautiful human triumph.